Hello, curious minds, and welcome to Documentary for Sleep. If you're here tonight, maybe your thoughts are a little heavy, maybe you're carrying fear or sadness yourself, or maybe you just want a gentle story to quiet the noise. Whether you're lying in bed, hoping to drift off, listening in the background while working late, or simply letting this play while you cook or shower, this is your space to slow down. Tonight, we're not talking about fantasy, but about the deep wiring of the human mind, about why emotions that hurt, like fear and sadness, exist at all. This is soft science, grounded in evolution and neuroscience, not wild speculation. We don't have every answer, but we do have clues from our ancestors, from the bones, from the brain, from the long history of survival. And if you happen to fall asleep halfway through, that's perfectly fine. I've left timestamps below so you can pick up tomorrow, because this is a story worth hearing in full. If you find comfort in this kind of quiet, long-form exploration, consider liking and subscribing. It helps us reach more curious sapiens who, like you, wonder about the mind and the past. And if you'd like, share in the comments how you listen, maybe from your bed, a night shift far away, or during a quiet moment of your day. And as always, stay curious. Stay calm. A child sits weeping in the dim light, a quiet tremor in the silence. No one has struck them, no external harm has been done. The sorrow simply is. It arrives uninvited, a heavy cloak that dims the vibrant colors of the world. But why? Why would a creature forged in the relentless fires of survival, a being honed to eat, to flee, to reproduce, possess the capacity for an emotional pain so profound it can extinguish the very will to live? This first sorrow seems an evolutionary paradox, a flaw in the design of an otherwise ruthlessly efficient machine. Within the architecture of the brain, this sadness has a physical address. Deep inside the human skull, the prefrontal cortex lights up with a specific melancholic signature, a pattern of neural activity largely absent in most other animals. It is a uniquely human landscape of suffering. Meanwhile, the hormone cortisol floods the system, a chemical tide that dampens the spark of dopamine. The result is not just pain, but a profound disinterest in life itself. The body has all it needs to function, yet the internal command to engage with the world is muted, as if a vital circuit has been quietly disconnected. This biological reality suggests sorrow is not a vague mood, but a precise physiological event, a systematic shutdown of desire. This event, however, is not a modern invention. In the deep, cool earth of a place called Shanidar, archaeologists uncovered a Neanderthal burial from tens of thousands of years ago. The bodies were laid to rest with care, accompanied by pollen from bright flowers. This silent testimony speaks louder than any clinical study. The capacity for grief, for a sorrow that rituals the passing of a life, is ancient. It predates civilization, agriculture, even our own species. It is a thread woven into the very fabric of our becoming, a shared inheritance from a time when the world was far colder and more dangerous. What survival advantage could such a vulnerable state possibly have offered in the shadow of glaciers and predators? The modern world provides a stark, statistical echo of this ancient ache. The World Health Organization now identifies depression as a leading cause of disability worldwide, affecting an estimated 280 million people. This is a pandemic not of pathogen, but of meaning. For the first time in history, masses of humanity are suffering not from a lack of food or shelter, but from a perceived lack of purpose. The very brain that conquered scarcity is now turning its complex mechanisms against itself in a quiet internal rebellion. We have mastered the external world, only to find ourselves adrift in an internal one, which leads to the unsettling central question: if sorrow is so costly, so potentially debilitating, why has evolution not scrubbed it from our genetic code? Nature is a brutally efficient editor, discarding traits that hinder reproduction and survival with cold indifference. A trait that encourages withdrawal and apathy should have been among the first to go. Its persistence, its deep-rooted presence across millennia, hints that it must serve a function. Perhaps this pain is not a glitch, but a feature so critical that its benefits, however counterintuitive, outweigh its terrible costs. Could this profound vulnerability be, in fact, an archaic survival tactic of the mind? To answer that, we must shift our gaze from the weight of sorrow to the lightning flash of fear. For if sadness is a slow, cold tide, fear is a jolt of electricity, a primal scream that echoes from the most ancient parts of the brain. It is a system designed not for reflection, but for immediate, life-preserving action. The amygdala, a small, almond-shaped cluster in the limbic system, is its command center. This neural relic is a gift from our most distant ancestors, a piece of circuitry shared with reptiles and rodents. Its logic is simple and brutal. Run first. Understand later. When a shadow darts at the corner of your vision, you jump before you consciously identify it as a falling leaf. This is the brain's escape plan in its purest form, a bypass of conscious thought in favor of instantaneous, life-saving motion. This mechanism kept our ancestors alive in a world of sharp teeth and sudden dangers. But what happens when this ancient alarm system is installed in a modern skull? A mind that can conceive of abstract threats like financial ruin, social rejection, or existential insignificance. The amygdala cannot distinguish between a saber-toothed tiger and a looming deadline. It only knows danger. The same jolt that once propelled a hominid away from a predator now floods a commuter with anxiety on a crowded train. The brain is still running, but often from shadows it itself has created. We have inherited a survival tool of immense power, yet we find ourselves trapped in a labyrinth of our own design, with an alarm that never fully silences. If the first sorrow is a shutdown, then fear is a relentless internal siren. But is a siren always a sign of an actual fire, or can it sometimes just be a fault in the wiring? A sound in the night, a floorboard creaks, a branch scrapes against the window. Before you can even form a thought, your body has already answered. Your heart hammers against your ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the sudden silence. Your palms grow cold and damp. You haven't seen a thing, but every muscle is coiled, ready for flight. This is the ancient echo of the running brain, a system honed over millennia to keep us alive. It is a ghost in the machine, a relic from a world long gone, now whispering warnings in a world of digital screens and fluorescent lights. Deep within the temporal lobe of every human brain lies a small, almond-shaped cluster of neurons called the amygdala. This is the sentinel, the watchman of the mind. Its purpose is primal and singular, to assess threat. It operates on a timeline measured in milliseconds, bypassing the slower, more deliberate circuits of the conscious mind. When it perceives danger, real or imagined, it sounds an alarm. The sympathetic nervous system ignites, flooding the body with cortisol and adrenaline. Blood is shunted from the digestive organs to the major muscle groups. Pupils dilate to gather every photon of available light. This is the biology of fear, a physiological cascade designed for one purpose: to run, to fight, to survive. It is a masterpiece of evolutionary engineering, but it is a system that cannot distinguish between a predator in the grass and an angry email in an inbox. We can see the shadow of this running brain etched into the archaeological record. From around 70,000 years ago, we begin to find the remnants of a technological revolution: projectile points, the carefully crafted tips of spears and arrows. These were not the tools of close-quarters combat. They were the weapons of distance, of preemptive strike. They speak of a new kind of fear, a fear not just of the immediate attack, but of the ambush, the unseen enemy lurking beyond the firelight. To develop such technology required a mind capable of projecting threat into the future, of imagining a danger that was not yet present. The running brain had evolved beyond simple reflexes. It had learned to hunt its own anxieties, to throw a spear at a phantom. This was the birth of strategic fear, a cognitive arms race where the greatest threat was often the one conjured by the mind itself. In the modern world, the predators have changed their form. The saber-toothed tiger has been replaced by the flashing notification on a smartphone. The looming deadline, the overwhelming inbox, the curated perfection of social media feeds, these are the new landscapes of threat. The amygdala, our faithful sentinel, still stands guard. It cannot tell the difference between social humiliation and physical peril. The same physiological response that once prepared our ancestors to flee a predator now tightens our chests as we scroll through a news feed. We call this generalized anxiety disorder, GAD, a state of constant low-grade alarm with no clear source. The running brain is still running, but it is sprinting on a treadmill, exhausting itself in a race against phantoms. The very mechanism that ensured our survival has become a source of profound psychological burden. This presents a curious paradox. The fear that once saved us can now imprison us. Where then is the line between healthy vigilance and a mind in chaos? Is a panic attack in a crowded supermarket merely a misfire of an ancient system? Or is it a rational, if exaggerated, response to a world of overwhelming social complexity? The running brain is not broken. It is simply responding to a world it was never designed to navigate. Its power is its flaw. It would rather mistake a shadow for a lion than a lion for a shadow. If fear is the emotion that tells us to run, to fight, to escape, then what of its quieter, slower cousin? What is the purpose of sadness? It offers no surge of adrenaline, no sharpened focus for flight. It does not help us run from anything. Instead, it seems to pull us inward, to slow the world to a crawl. In a life governed by the imperative of survival, what possible evolutionary advantage could there be in simply stopping? If fear is the map for escape, then perhaps sadness is the compass that points to a different kind of truth, one that lies not in the territory ahead, but in the landscape we have already left behind. What direction does it point to when the immediate danger is not a beast, but a deep and lingering chill? 26,000 years ago, a mother wraps a fur tighter around her shivering child. The wind, a blade of ice, scours the entrance of their rock shelter. The fever is high. There are no predators here tonight, no rival clans. The enemy is the cold itself, an invisible, relentless force that steals the warmth from small lungs. Her child does not die from a claw or a spear, but from the absence of heat. And in that silent, frigid dawn, a particular kind of sorrow is born. Not the fleeting alarm of danger, but the profound, lingering ache of loss. It is a grief that will echo through millennia. This sorrow, we now understand, was not a flaw in our design, but a feature etched deep into our biology. In the harsh arithmetic of survival, positive emotions like joy and excitement are costly. They demand energy, spur action, and encourage social engagement. But when the body is wounded, when illness strikes or resources vanish, a different program must run. Negative emotions like sadness activate an endogenous withdrawal system. It is a biological imperative to retreat. Metabolism slows, social interaction dwindles, and the world narrows to the confines of a single aching self. This is not a failure of spirit, but a conservation strategy, a way to hoard precious energy, to heal in stillness, and to signal to the tribe, through a downcast gaze and quiet demeanor, a need for care. The mother's grief, in its paralyzing depth, may have been what kept her alive long enough to mourn, a necessary pause in a world that rarely stopped demanding. This ancient, biological script is not merely inferred, it is painted on the walls of our first sanctuaries. In the deep caves of Lascaux, where Ice Age humans took refuge, the art is not solely a chronicle of triumph. Among the vibrant depictions of charging bison and sturdy horses, there are quieter, more haunting scenes. A wounded animal, isolated and stumbling, a human figure, kneeling, head in hands, a posture unmistakably conveying despair. These were not just instruction manuals for the hunt. They were the first narratives of shared experience. They say, we also know loss. We also feel the sting of failure, the weight of a life taken, the hollow space where a companion once stood. The cave was a cathedral of collective memory, and sorrow had its altar there, right beside the celebration of the kill. It was a public acknowledgement that to be human was to be vulnerable, and that this vulnerability was the very glue of the community. This primal function of sadness finds a stark, modern echo in the sterile corridors of our hospitals. Studies now reveal a chilling correlation. Patients who report feeling lonely and deeply sad have significantly higher mortality rates. The emotion itself, when allowed its natural course and met with social support, is a regulatory tool. It is a silent, powerful plea that, when answered, mends not just the psyche, but the body, a friend's hand, a family's vigil. These responses are the modern equivalent of sharing warmth in a frozen world. The sadness that prompts connection is a healthy signal, a vital part of our social immune system. It whispers that we are not built to endure the cold alone. Yet, this delicate system holds a perilous paradox. What happens when the signal has no receiver? When the withdrawal does not lead to healing, but to a deeper, more permanent isolation? When sorrow, a transient cloud, becomes the permanent climate of the mind, it curdles into depression. It is the same biological mechanism, stripped of its purpose, turned against its host. The energy-conserving stillness becomes a paralyzing prison. The social withdrawal becomes an unbridgeable chasm. How do we distinguish, then, between a healthy, adaptive emotion, a necessary gray-skied day in the emotional year, and a pathological storm that blots out the sun? The line is terrifyingly fine, drawn not by the feeling itself, but by its duration, its intensity, and crucially, by the presence or absence of a warm hand in the darkness. Perhaps we have been asking the wrong question. Maybe sorrow's primary purpose was never just about individual survival, about managing internal danger. Perhaps its deeper function was always social. It is the emotion that carves out a space for empathy, that forces the tribe to stop and tend to its wounded. That mother's grief, witnessed by her clan, would have strengthened the bonds that held them all together against the ice. It was a shared language of need long before words existed to describe it. So, if sorrow helps sculpt the very shape of our ancestral communities, binding us together in mutual care, what does it mean that we now often experience it in such profound isolation? Does the hum of our modern world simply drown out a signal that was meant to be heard? The dog, curled in a sunbeam, finds a universe of contentment in the simple mechanics of its existence. A full belly, a familiar scent, the promise of a walk. Its world is a perfect circle, drawn in the immediate present. We, however, sit in our climate-controlled apartments, surrounded by more food than a Paleolithic tribe would see in a year, and we feel a hollow space opening up inside. The mind, that magnificent engine of survival, turns inward and begins to consume itself. What strange transaction has occurred here? We traded the certainty of the moment for the dizzying, infinite horizon of tomorrow, and in doing so, we may have purchased our intelligence with a currency of quiet sorrow. This internal chasm has a physical address, etched into the very architecture of our brains. It is the prefrontal cortex, a recently evolved landscape of neural pathways that allows us to do something no other creature can: travel through time. This is the seat of imagination, the projector that casts possible futures onto the screen of our consciousness. It is what lets an architect visualize a skyscraper from a blank page, a composer hear a symphony in the silence. But this gift is a double-edged sword. The same circuitry that builds cathedrals in the mind also constructs prisons. It is the factory of anxiety, which is merely the anticipation of a negative future, the museum of regret, which is the relentless replay of an unchangeable past, and the courtroom of self-reproach, where we are both the accused and the unforgiving judge. The dog fears the raised voice, the immediate threat. We fear a stock market crash next quarter, a missed opportunity from a decade ago, a lingering comment that poisoned a relationship. Our brilliance is our burden, a biological paradox where the very organ that ensures our survival simultaneously torments it. Is this the original sin of consciousness, to be aware of time and thus of all the ways things can go wrong? If we dig into the layers of our past, the evidence suggests this existential weight is not an ancient companion. The archaeological record paints a picture of early humans consumed by immediate, tangible concerns: the tracking of prey, the crafting of a tool, the search for shelter. Their anxieties were written in the language of physical survival: the gnaw of hunger, the chill of wind, the proximity of predators. There are no cave paintings depicting a figure gazing at the stars, pondering the meaning of it all. The turning point seems to coil around a revolution that forever changed our relationship with the world: the advent of agriculture. With the concept of ownership, this land is mine, these grains are ours, came new forms of worry. The future was no longer just the next hunt, it was the next harvest, vulnerable to drought and blight. With settled communities came hierarchy, religion, and the birth of abstract gods who demanded appeasement. For the first time, humanity had something permanent to lose, and with that permanence came the fertile ground for existential dread. The anxiety of scarcity was joined by the anxiety of purpose. Were we living correctly? Were the gods pleased? Had we stored enough to survive the winter? The human mind, once focused on the sharp point of the present, began to spin vast, intricate webs of what if and why. This trajectory only accelerates in the modern age. Our intelligence has granted us dominion over the planet. We have split the atom, decoded the genome, and built networks that connect the entire globe in a shimmering web of light and information. We have created artificial intelligences that can outperform us in logic games and pattern recognition. Yet, in the shadow of these staggering achievements, the ancient questions have not been silenced. They have been amplified. The same cognitive power that designs a spacecraft allows a person lying awake at 3 a.m. to deconstruct their entire life, to question the very foundation of their relationships, their career, their existence. We have conquered external threats only to find the most formidable enemy resides within. Depression, in this light, is not a simple malfunction, but a perverse testament to our capabilities, a system overwhelmed by its own capacity for reflection, a mind that has built such a complex model of reality that it can find no satisfactory place for itself within it. The tool that built civilization becomes the instrument of our personal desolation. Is the pinnacle of evolution also its most exquisite trap? A tempting, almost cynical conclusion emerges from this line of thought. If intelligence is the source of our unhappiness, then is ignorance the path to bliss? Would we be better off, like the dog in the sunbeam, untroubled by the metaphysical? This is the seductive allure of the primitive, the romanticized notion of the noble savage. But this is a false dichotomy, a simplistic retreat from complexity. Perhaps the capacity for sorrow is not the flaw, but the feature. The depth of our sadness is a direct measure of the depth of our caring, our empathy, our love. The dog may feel momentary distress, but does it know the profound, aching grief of losing a lifelong companion? Does it feel the bittersweet joy of nostalgia, the burning passion of a moral cause, the sublime awe of a starry night understood through the lens of astrophysics? Our pain is the inverse of our transcendence. It is the shadow cast by our brightest lights. The very fact that we can feel such a vast, nuanced spectrum of emotion, from despair to ecstasy, is what separates us from the rest of the natural world. To wish away the sadness is to wish away the capacity for joy itself. Could it be that our humanity is most fully expressed not in spite of our suffering, but through it? So we are left standing at a crossroads, holding the magnificent and punishing gift of our own minds. The prefrontal cortex, that cradle of our future selves, is also the source of our deepest anxieties. The agricultural revolution, which gave us security, also gave us the space for existential fear. Our modern wonders are mirrored by modern forms of despair. If this intricate dance of intellect and emotion is the price of our evolution, a mandatory toll for the journey from animal to human, then what does that say about the path ahead? As we stand on the brink of shaping intelligence itself, of coding it into silicon and setting it loose upon the world, we must confront a haunting reflection. If consciousness inevitably begets a certain loneliness, then what ghosts might we be building into the minds of our creations? And if our individual sorrow is the price for a self-aware mind, what then is the nature of the shared nightmares that bind us together? The 5-year-old is not being punished. It is lunchtime at the kindergarten, a space of bright colors and cheerful noise. But for this one child, the world has collapsed into a silent, terrifying vacuum. He has been left behind, momentarily overlooked in the bustle. No one has raised a voice. No physical threat is present. Yet, his small body is hijacked by a primal alarm. His lungs heave with sobs that seem to tear from a place deeper than fear. He is not afraid of death, not in that moment. He is afraid of something far more ancient and, to his developing mind, far more certain, the terror of being left. This is not a rational calculation. It is a biological imperative, a nightmare written into the very code of his being, a nightmare of community. The biology of this panic is as real as the flush on his cheeks. Emotions we label as shame, social anxiety, or guilt are not merely fleeting thoughts. They are full-body events, orchestrated by the same ancient neural circuitry that screams, "Run," when confronted by a predator. The heart hammers, the muscles tense, adrenaline floods the bloodstream. But the trigger is different. The threat is not a set of claws and teeth. It is a shift in the social atmosphere, a cold shoulder, averted eyes, the chilling silence of exclusion. This system is exquisitely tuned to detect the most dangerous threat our ancestors faced, the threat of being cast out from the group. For a social species, ostracism was not a social inconvenience. It was a death sentence, a slower, more desolate end than any confrontation with a wild beast. The panic that grips the child is an evolutionary heirloom, a fire alarm that still blares even though the original nature of the fire may have changed. We can trace the contours of this ancient social contract in the faint echoes of our past. Our ancestors did not stride across the savannah as solitary giants. They huddled together in small, fragile bands. Survival was a collective project. A lone human was a dead human, vulnerable to starvation, predation, and the elements. In this context, the ability to synchronize emotions was not a luxury but a vital social technology. The sting of shame after a conflict, the gnawing anxiety following a betrayal, the deep sorrow of discord, these were not personal failings. They were a brilliant, internalized regulatory system. They were the social glue, the invisible forces that pulled individuals back into harmony, ensuring the cohesion of the tribe. To feel bad about a social rupture was to be motivated to repair it. The pain was the price of belonging, a tax paid to the community for the ultimate prize of continued existence. The child's lunchtime despair is a direct descendant of this ancient life-preserving anguish. And yet, this beautifully calibrated system now operates in a world its designers could never have imagined. The modern teenager, scrolling through a cascade of curated social lives on a screen, faces a version of this ancient threat that is both diluted and magnified to a terrifying degree. The physical danger of being alone is largely gone. A teenager exiled from a lunch table will not starve or be eaten by wolves. But the biological alarm has not been updated. The rise of adolescent depression is starkly correlated with social environments, particularly schools, where the threat of being outgrouped or simply ignored can feel more devastating than direct physical violence. The tools of ostracism have become subtler, more insidious. A withheld like, a whispered conversation that stops when you approach, the agonizing silence of a read message that receives no reply. The pain is no less acute. In fact, it may be more so, because it lacks the clear, brutal finality of a physical attack, instead festering as a chronic, ambiguous wound. Is the system still serving us, or has it become a source of unnecessary, even pathological suffering? Has a mechanism designed for survival in a tribal world become a cruel and irrational burden in an individualistic one? So, we are left with a paradox. Our negative emotions, the very ones we seek to medicate or avoid, are not merely personal flaws to be eliminated. They are sophisticated, if often clumsy, navigational tools honed over millennia to steer us through the complex waters of social life. They are the legacy of the tribe, whispering its ancient rules in the language of visceral sensation. But this same mechanism, so essential for our ancestors, can now turn against its host. The alarm that once warned of a genuine physical peril now screams at the shadow of a social slight. The very system that bound the tribe together can, in the alien landscape of modernity, tear an individual apart from the inside. This raises a deeper, more unsettling possibility. If the pain of social exclusion can trigger a physiological panic response so powerful it mimics the fear of death, what happens when that pain is not a fleeting alarm, but a constant, grinding state of being? If a broken social bond can feel like a physical wound, can the weight of a shattered world, a broken heart, actually manifest as a tangible injury to the body itself? Can sorrow, in its most profound form, become not just a metaphor for pain, but the very cause of it? She was found in her garden, kneeling by the rose bushes he had planted for their 40th anniversary. There was no struggle, no cry for help, just a quiet collapse onto the damp earth. The medical report would list the cause as complications from a myocardial infarction, but her doctor, who had seen this pattern before, wrote 2 words in the margin of his notes: broken heart. In the weeks following her husband's peaceful passing in his sleep, she had simply faded. Her body, robust and healthy for her 8 decades, had surrendered to a force no scan could detect and no pill could cure. It was as if the central pillar of her existence had been removed, and the entire structure, deprived of its essential support, could no longer bear its own weight. This is not mere poetic metaphor, it is a physiological reality. The human heart, that relentless muscle we reduce to a symbol of love, is terrifyingly literal in its vulnerability. Acute grief can trigger a condition known as Takotsubo cardiomyopathy or broken heart syndrome. In a cruel twist of biological irony, a surge of stress hormones, adrenaline, cortisol, floods the system, not to empower the body for a fight, but to stun it into submission. The left ventricle, the heart's primary pumping chamber, weakens and balloons, taking on a shape that Japanese scientists in the 1990s likened to a takotsubo, a pot used for trapping octopi. The heart becomes its own trap. In this state, it struggles to pump blood, mimicking the symptoms of a catastrophic heart attack, but often without any of the characteristic arterial blockages. It is a failure born purely of distress, a direct line drawn from the storm in the mind to the faltering rhythm in the chest. The nervous system, that ancient conduit of instinct and emotion, whispers a command of such profound sorrow that the very organ of life begins to betray itself. How fragile is the boundary, then, between a feeling and a fatal event? This deep-seated connection between attachment and mortality is not a modern affliction. It is a thread woven into the very fabric of our species, a story told not in words, but in bone and earth. At the site of Çatalhöyük in Anatolia, one of the world's oldest known settlements, archaeologists uncovered a grave dating back 9,000 years. Within it, a man and a woman were buried together, their skeletons locked in a final, eternal embrace. Their bones speak a silent, powerful language that predates writing, predates the formal concept of marriage as we know it. They testify to a bond so profound that even in death, they were not to be parted. This was not a ritualistic sacrifice or a practical arrangement for the afterlife. The tenderness of their posture suggests a connection of the heart. It is evidence that the capacity for profound attachment, for a love whose severance could cause an existential wound, is an ancient, intrinsic part of being human. Long before we had words for grief, our bodies knew its architecture. What does it mean that our deepest need for connection is etched into our oldest graves? The modern world, for all its clinical detachment, has only quantified this ancient truth. Epidemiological studies have delivered a stark statistic. In the first year following the death of a spouse, the surviving partner's risk of dying increases by as much as 66%. This is not attributable to shared poor habits or a common genetic flaw. It is the widowhood effect, a term that sanitizes a brutal reality. People do not simply die of a broken heart in a sentimental sense. They succumb to a cascade of physiological consequences. The immune system weakens, inflammation rises, the will to engage in self-care evaporates. The world loses its color, its taste, its purpose. The soul's injury manifests as a body that has lost its reason to continue. It is a slow, silent yielding, a demonstration that a life can be extinguished not by disease, but by the sheer weight of absence. If love is a biological imperative, is grief its inevitable, lethal tax? This leads to a troubling evolutionary paradox. If profound grief is so destructive, so capable of cutting a life short, why has natural selection not weeded it out? From a cold Darwinian perspective, a trait that so frequently leads to death should be a catastrophic disadvantage. Is it a dangerous flaw, a tragic bug in our emotional software? Or is the very capacity for such deep sorrow the inseparable shadow of an even greater strength? Perhaps the bond that can kill us in its absence is the same bond that allowed us to survive in the first place. The intense social cohesion, the willingness to sacrifice for kin and tribe, the shared care of young, these are the foundations of human success. The same neurological and hormonal systems that facilitate profound love are the ones that unleash profound grief. You cannot have one without the other. The system is a package deal. Is grief, then, not a flaw, but the exorbitant price paid for a gift of immeasurable value? The ability to connect so deeply that another person becomes a part of our own biological operating system? We are left with a haunting contemplation. The depth of our sorrow is a direct measure of the depth of our connection. To feel a loss so acutely that the body itself begins to shut down is not a sign of weakness, but a testament to the power of the bond that was severed. It suggests that our emotions are not ephemeral, ghostly things separate from our physical selves. They are powerful biological forces, as real as any virus or nutrient. They can sculpt the shape of a beating heart and dictate the timeline of a life. In this light, the ability to die of a broken heart is not a curse, but a terrifying and profound capability. It is the ultimate evidence that we are not just collections of cells, but integrated beings of story and synapse, of love and loss. And if the pain of loss can so thoroughly dismantle us, what does that say about the architecture of a mind that must constantly navigate a world filled with potential for such pain? If our connections are our greatest strength and our greatest vulnerability, how does the human psyche, aware of this precarious equation, learn to live with the ever-present shadow of its own profound sensitivity? The arrow entered from behind, a silent, calculated strike. It pierced the base of the skull, traveled downward through the intricate lattice of tissue and bone, and came to rest near the shoulder blade. The man fell forward, his body preserved in the icy cradle of the Ötztal Alps for 5 millennia. We know him as Ötzi, the Iceman. His story, written in his bones and his gear, speaks of a life of rugged survival. But his death speaks of something else entirely. It speaks of us. He was not killed by a predator or a fall. He was killed by another human being, someone who approached from behind, with intention. This ancient crime scene, frozen in time, is not an anomaly. It is a testament to a profound and unsettling truth woven into the very fabric of our existence. Throughout history, the greatest threat to a human has almost always been another human. Our brains, the very instruments of our civilization and compassion, are also exquisitely tuned instruments of social threat detection. Evolution, in its relentless calculus, gifted us a magnificent and burdensome organ, the social brain. The neocortex expanded, allowing us to collaborate, to plan, to empathize. We became adept at reading the subtle language of a furrowed brow, the slight tightening around the eyes, the micro shift in posture that signals disapproval or aggression. This ability to step into another's mind, to predict their intentions, was the key to forming tribes, to hunting mammoths, to building the first shelters. It was the foundation of trust. But this same ability has a shadow side. For every genuine smile we correctly interpret, we are also primed to see a sneer where none exists. Our neural circuitry, honed on the African savanna, is a legacy system constantly scanning for social danger. Is that person from the next valley a potential ally for trade, or a scout for a raiding party? Is their laughter genuine or mocking? This constant low-grade vigilance is the price we pay for our hypersociality. We are trapped in a beautiful, terrifying paradox. We need each other to survive, yet we are perpetually aware that any one of us could be the source of the other's demise. We are, in a sense, walking repositories of ancient fears, our every social interaction filtered through a lens polished by millennia of conflict. If our biology hints at this deep-seated wariness, the silent testimony of the earth confirms it. The romantic notion of a peaceful, noble savage living in primal harmony is a comforting fiction shattered by the evidence buried beneath our feet. Archaeological sites from across the globe tell a consistent, somber story. At a place called Nataruk in Kenya, the skeletons of a group of hunter-gatherers lie scattered, dating back over 10,000 years. The bones bear the unmistakable marks of violent death. Crushed skulls, projectile points embedded in bone, hands and feet suggesting they were bound. This was not a skirmish over a hunting ground. It was a massacre. Similarly, in Talheim, Germany, a mass grave from the Neolithic period reveals the remains of 34 people, men, women, and children, brutally killed with blows to the head from stone axes. They were not given the dignity of a burial. They were dumped in a pit, a stark monument to intergroup violence. These are not isolated incidents. From the plains of North America to the shores of Scandinavia, the archaeological record is punctuated by such findings. The evidence suggests that long before the advent of standing armies or organized warfare, violence between groups of humans was a recurring feature of life. The club, it seems, is almost as ancient a tool as the cradle. These silent bones ask a deafening question. If cooperation was our primary strategy, why is the landscape of our past so littered with the victims of our own kind? This ancient legacy does not remain confined to the past. It echoes within the very structure of our modern anxieties. The frantic pace of the modern world, the constant barrage of information, the dizzying diversity of a globalized society, all of this places an unprecedented strain on our ancient threat detection systems. The fear of the outsider, the stranger, is no longer about a rival band from the next valley. It has been abstracted and amplified. It manifests as the low hum of suspicion towards immigrants, the political polarization that paints the other side as not just wrong, but evil, and the social anxiety that can make a crowded party feel like a gauntlet of potential judgment. Our social media feeds become hyper-real simulations of the tribal landscape, where a misspoken word can trigger a digital stampede of outrage, a modern-day equivalent of being cast out from the safety of the group. This is not merely a cultural phenomenon, it is a neurological one. Our amygdala, the ancient alarm bell of the brain, is being bombarded with signals it was never designed to process. A critical comment from a stranger online can trigger the same physiological stress response as a physical confrontation might have for our ancestors. The system is overloaded. The very mechanisms that once ensured our survival, hypervigilance, a keen sensitivity to social threat, a tendency to form tight in-groups and view outsiders with caution, are now, in the context of our complex, interconnected world, generating a pandemic of loneliness, anxiety disorders, and depression. The defenses have become the disease, yet is it fair to label these deep-seated emotions as purely maladaptive? To see them only as flaws in our modern lives is to misunderstand their original purpose: fear, suspicion, even the desire to withdraw. These were not pathologies for the greater part of human history. They were sophisticated survival algorithms. In a world where a chance encounter with a stranger could mean death or enslavement, a healthy dose of paranoia was a virtue. The individual who was slightly more cautious, who hesitated before entering an unfamiliar clearing, who slept a little lighter, had a statistical advantage. Their genes and their cautious temperament were more likely to be passed on. What we now diagnose as social anxiety might have once been the very trait that allowed a mother to protect her children from a rival group. The urge to retreat from the overwhelming social sphere, which we pathologize as depression, might have been a necessary conservation of energy, a strategic withdrawal during times of scarcity or danger. These emotional responses are ancient, deeply ingrained tools. The problem is not the tools themselves, but the fact that we are now trying to use a Stone Age toolkit to navigate a digital age world. The question then shifts: are these feelings a malfunction, or are they a perfectly functional system operating in an environment it was never built for? Is the fault in our wiring or in the world we have built around it? So we are left with a haunting inheritance. The same fear that once snapped our ancestors' heads around at the sound of a breaking twig, that flooded their bodies with the adrenaline to fight or flee, now simmers beneath the surface of our civilized lives. It is the root of the unexplained dread in a crowded elevator, the tightness in the chest before a presentation, the corrosive worry that we are not enough, that we will be rejected by the tribe. This fear, etched into our DNA and confirmed by the bones of the past, was our protector. It now often feels like our jailer. It helped us survive a world of tangible physical threats. But has it left us ill-equipped to navigate a world of psychological and social complexity? We have conquered so many of the external dangers that plagued our ancestors: predators, famine, disease, only to find that the most persistent threat, the one we carry with us, is the ghost in our own machine, the shadow in the human heart. And if this fear is so deeply written into us, a story told in the language of neurons and ancient graves, then where does it truly reside? Is it a memory, not just of individual trauma, but of a species? Could it be that we are born not as blank slates, but with the faint whispering echoes of dangers we have never personally known? A 9-month-old baby who has never seen a snake, never been warned of its danger, startles and turns its face away from a picture of one. The reaction is swift, visceral, and seemingly pre-programmed. It arrives not from personal experience, but from somewhere deeper, a whisper from a past the child has never lived. Where does this silent alarm come from? Is it possible that fear itself can be inherited, not as a story told by a trembling parent, but as a biological memory etched into the very code of life? This instinctive recoil is a ghost in the machine of our modern minds. We live in cities of steel and glass, insulated from the wilderness that cradled and threatened our ancestors for millennia. Yet, the ancient circuitry still hums with a current of old dangers. The fear of snakes and spiders, of heights and the dark, feels universal, primal. Science now suggests these are not just cultural quirks, but may be profound legacies, a form of emotional DNA passed down through generations. This is not memory as we know it, a narrative of personal events, but something more elemental, a predisposition, a physiological setting tuned by the survival struggles of those who came before us. It is the echo of a heartbeat quickening in a long-vanished forest, now felt in a brightly lit nursery. The mechanism for this transmission lies in the subtle, powerful realm of epigenetics. If our DNA is the immutable text of our biological inheritance, then epigenetics is the system of annotations written in the margins. These are chemical markers that attach to our genes, not altering the fundamental sequence but dictating how loudly or softly a gene is expressed. They act like dimmer switches on a lamp, controlling the intensity of a trait. Trauma, stress, and prolonged fear can leave these marks, effectively turning certain genetic predispositions up or down. A generation that lived through famine might pass on epigenetic changes that promote fat storage. Similarly, a deep, evolutionarily honed fear, a terror so essential for survival that it needed to be instinctive, could be encoded not as a specific memory of a snake, but as a heightened sensitivity to serpentine shapes, a hair-trigger amygdala ready to scream danger at the sight of a slithering form. The baby's startle is not a recalled event, but the expression of a gene whose volume was turned to maximum by the relentless predator pressure of the past. The fear is a ghost, but the biological response is concrete, a testament to the fact that our bodies are living archives of ancestral experience. To understand the origin of this fear, we must step back into the world that sculpted it. Imagine the life of a prehistoric human, a world painted in shades of green and brown, where every shadow held potential. Death did not announce itself with the blare of a horn or the screech of tires. It was silent, patient, coiled in the undergrowth, or dangling from a branch. In this environment, hesitation was extinction. The ability to instantly recognize a threat, the sinuous curve of a snake, the multiple-legged scuttle of a venomous spider, the gleam of large eyes in the dark, was not a psychological quirk. It was the most vital of survival tools. The brain developed a rapid, non-conscious pathway for threat detection, bypassing slower, logical reasoning. It was better to jump at the sight of a stick that looked like a snake than to pause and confirm whether the snake was real. This better safe than sorry principle, repeated over hundreds of thousands of years, carved deep grooves into our neural landscape. The emotion of fear became a sophisticated cognitive shortcut, a gift from our ancestors that allowed them to live long enough to become our ancestors. Is our deepest anxiety, then, not a flaw, but the price paid for 1,000,000 successful escapes? This ancient programming persists, a stubborn relic in a world it no longer fully understands. Modern children, surrounded by plastic and pavement, still exhibit a heightened ability to spot snakes and spiders among distracting imagery, compared to neutral objects like flowers or frogs. The primal brain, the old guard, remains on duty, vigilant against threats that have largely receded. It interprets the sudden, loud noise of a car backfiring with the same adrenal rush it once reserved for the roar of a predator. Our negative emotions, particularly these primal fears, can be seen as a form of preloaded software, an operating system optimized for an environment that has dramatically changed. The panic attack in a crowded mall, the irrational dread of a harmless spider, the unease of standing on a high balcony, are these malfunctions? Or are they the correct, albeit outdated, responses of a system built for a different world? What does it mean that our most visceral reactions are often echoes of a reality we have left behind? But if these negative emotions are merely inherited scripts, biological echoes of dangers long past, does that not grant us an extraordinary power? The realization that a fear may not be ours in a personal sense, but a collective heirloom, creates a critical space for intervention. It suggests we are not helpless prisoners of our amygdala. Neuroscience reveals the brain's remarkable plasticity, its ability to rewire itself based on experience. Through conscious effort, through therapy, through gradual exposure and cognitive reframing, we can essentially build new neural pathways that can quiet the old alarms. We can learn to acknowledge the primal fear without being governed by it. We can thank the ancient part of our brain for its vigilance while calmly informing it that the coiled rope on the ground is not a threat. This is the promise of modern psychology, that we can, in a sense, reprogram our genetic inheritance. We can update the software. But in doing so, are we silencing a wise old counselor, or are we finally evolving beyond the need for its constant, fearful warnings? This leads to a deeper, more unsettling question. If we can, and perhaps should, work to mitigate the debilitating effects of irrational fears, what would it mean to attempt to erase them entirely? These negative emotions, for all the suffering they cause, are part of the deep tapestry of what it means to be human. They are the flip side of our capacity for caution, vigilance, and survival. They connect us to the long, unbroken chain of human existence. To remove them would be to sever a link to our own history, to the struggles that shaped our bodies and minds. Would a human without the innate fear of a snake be more free? Or would they be unmoored from a fundamental aspect of their biological story? What other, subtler instincts might be intertwined with these fears, perhaps a respect for the wild, an understanding of our place in a larger, dangerous world. If we silence the whispers of the past completely, what song of our own humanity would we be left with? And if we were to trace this thread of inherited fear further back, might we find its first transformation not in a laboratory or a therapist's office, but in the flickering firelight of a prehistoric cave? What compelled those early artists to descend into the deep, dark earth and paint magnificent, terrifying images of the very beasts they feared? The bison, the bear, the lion. Was this perhaps humanity's first attempt at therapy, a way to externalize the internal dread, to hold the fear at bay by giving it a form, a name, and a place on the wall? Could it be that the first act of art was not merely decoration, but a profound ritual of confrontation, an effort to make sense of the ancestral sadness and terror that already lived within them? Deep in the cool, silent womb of the Lascaux cave, the torchlight flickers, casting dancing shadows upon the walls. But these are not the shadows of the living. They are the fixed, eternal shadows of the fallen. Here, across the ancient stone canvas, aurochs stumble, their massive forms pierced by spears, their legs buckling in a final, graceful surrender. Bison lie contorted, their life force seeping into the pictorial ground. This is not a gallery of triumphs. It is a sanctuary of sorrow, a form of primordial graffiti, etched not in a moment of conquest, but in the raw, trembling aftermath of defeat, a testament to an encounter with mortality that left the hunter, not just the hunted, irrevocably changed. These images are not mere records of a hunt. They are the crystallized echo of a profound sadness, a dialogue with death painted in ochre and charcoal. Why would our ancestors return to the deep, dangerous dark? Not to depict their power, but to immortalize their vulnerability. The answer may be written not just in the stone, but in the very architecture of our minds. When fear grips us, or grief hollows us out, a primal duet is performed within the brain. The amygdala, that ancient sentinel of emotion, sounds the alarm, flooding the body with the visceral reality of the feeling. Simultaneously, the hippocampus, the scribe of memory, diligently begins its work, weaving the emotional tempest into the fabric of our personal timeline. The brain, in its infinite wisdom, does not merely feel, it logs the feeling. It seeks to translate the unspeakable ache of loss, the cold clutch of fear, into a form that can be held, observed, and perhaps understood. Could those first strokes of pigment on rock have been the mind's first attempt at this translation? A way to externalize the internal storm, to take the chaotic, terrifying image of a dying beast, a sight that meant both survival and profound loss, and pin it to the wall, thus pinning down a piece of the fear itself? The art becomes a neurological ledger, a diary of dread and awe. Archaeology whispers that these caves were rarely homes. They were cathedrals of emotion. The difficulty of access, the absence of everyday debris, suggests these were special places, set apart from the sunlit world of subsistence and social chatter. They were biospheric expressive spaces, reserved for rituals we can only dimly perceive. Here, in the flickering silence, surrounded by the painted ghosts of their prey, early humans may have performed the first act of emotional alchemy. By rendering their anxieties, the fear of starvation, the trauma of the kill, the mystery of death, into tangible form, they began the process of mastering them. The act of painting the wounded bison was perhaps an act of confronting the wound it had inflicted on their own psyche. This was not escapism. It was a profound engagement with the negative. The earliest art, then, might not have been a celebration of beauty, but a crucial technology for processing the terrifying beauty of being alive. It was the original therapy session, held by firelight, with the entire cosmos as a witness. This ancient impulse echoes with a startling clarity in the rhythms of our modern world. Today, a teenager in a dimly lit room doesn't paint a wounded bison on a wall. They open a digital audio workstation and compose a melancholic melody, the minor chords a vessel for a heartbreak they cannot otherwise articulate. Another covers a canvas in abstract, angry slashes of color, a storm of emotion made visible. A filmmaker crafts a dark, unsettling narrative, not to glorify despair, but to expel it from within. These are not acts of wallowing. They are acts of healing. The creation of sad music, dark art, and somber stories is our contemporary Lascaux. It is the same primal reflex, to externalize the internal, to give shape to the shadow, and in doing so, to rob it of a little of its power. The studio, the notebook, the song. These are our accessible caves, spaces where we are permitted to be gloriously, creatively unhappy. This continuity, however, forces a difficult, almost heretical question upon our society that prizes relentless positivity and emotional control. If the need to express negative emotion is so deeply embedded in our biology and our history, if it is in fact a fundamental mechanism for psychological survival, then what is the cost of our modern mandate to suppress it? The cultural imperatives to stay positive, to look on the bright side, to control yourself, begin to seem like a rebellion against our own nature. Are we, in our quest for constant happiness, inadvertently stifling a vital coping mechanism? Does the pressure to compress our grief, anxiety, and sadness into a neat, invisible box simply cause it to leak out in more destructive ways? As illness, as rage, as a pervasive, low-grade despair that lacks a creative outlet? The cave painter did not hide from the reality of death. They painted it, honored it, and communed with it. In asking ourselves to ignore our own figurative wounded bison, are we attempting to live outside the very emotional ecosystem that shaped us? From the blood and ochre visions in the deep earth to the haunting melodies streaming through our headphones, a thread connects us to those ancient artists. It suggests that sorrow, in its raw, unvarnished state, is not the enemy of creativity, but its potent, if difficult, fuel. It is the grit around which the pearl of art forms. Yet, this acknowledgement leads not to a conclusion, but to a threshold. If sadness is a catalyst, does it have a point of diminishing returns? Can one dwell too long in the cave, the images on the wall becoming not a means of processing pain but a shrine to it? When does the act of expression cease to be a release and become a prison? And if the cave was for solitary reflection, where did our ancestors go to share the weight of what they found? There? Perhaps they carried it out, into the flickering communal light of a different kind of fire, one that warmed not just the body, but the collective soul, and where a shared anxiety could become the very thing that bound the tribe together. The darkness beyond the flickering circle of firelight was not merely an absence of light. It was a presence, a weight of unknown terrors. Huddled close for warmth, our ancestors felt the chill of the night not just on their skin, but deep within their bones. A storyteller's voice, low and steady, recounts the day's hunt, the one that got away, the near-fatal charge of a mammoth, the sudden, silent death of a companion from a sickness no one understood. A shiver runs through the group. Is it from the cold, or from the shared dread that coils in the pit of every stomach? The fire here does more than ward off predators and provide warmth. It illuminates the collective soul, casting long, dancing shadows of a new, uniquely human anxiety. This is the birthplace of shared fear, the primordial campfire where individual worry transformed into a collective possession. The biology of this transformation is etched into our very chemistry. When we gather in a state of heightened emotion, our bodies release a powerful hormone, oxytocin. Often dubbed the bonding molecule or the cuddle chemical, it floods our systems during moments of intimacy, trust, and cooperation, weaving invisible threads of connection between us. It is the biological glue of the tribe, the feeling that makes a mother protect her child and a warrior defend his kin. Yet this same mechanism possesses a curious duality. The neurobiological pathways that allow oxytocin to foster profound empathy and solidarity are also perfectly designed for the rapid transmission of panic. Fear, in this context, is not a weakness, but a vital, contagious signal. When one member of the group tenses, their dilated pupils, sharp intake of breath, and elevated heart rate are unconsciously detected by others. The oxytocin-fueled empathy that allows us to feel a companion's joy also compels us to mirror their terror. It is a system of brilliant efficiency for survival. A single startled gasp can electrify an entire group into defensive readiness. But what happens when the threat is not a saber-toothed cat in the bushes, but an amorphous, unnameable dread born from a story? The very tool that binds the tribe together becomes the conduit for a shared psychosis, a collective anxiety with no clear source and no easy escape. Is empathy, then, not just a capacity for love, but also a vulnerability to a shared madness? We can find the archaeological echoes of these first anxious gatherings in the silent testimony of ancient hearths. At sites dating back to the Middle Paleolithic, long before the advent of agriculture or permanent settlements, we find more than just the scattered bones of meals. We find carefully arranged fire pits, some surrounded by stones, suggesting a designated space for congregation, not just combustion. These are not the transient campfires of a hominid simply cooking a meal before moving on. These are the first living rooms, the first town squares. Around these fires, Homo sapiens did something extraordinary. They likely began to use symbolic language, to recount the day's events, to mourn their dead, and to speculate about the forces of nature that governed their lives. In the flickering light, the world of hard, immediate survival, the hunt, the gathering, the escape, blurred into a world of abstract thought. It was here that the concept of a past that haunts and a future that threatens was truly born. The shared stories of a hunt gone wrong were no longer just practical lessons. They became parables of vulnerability. The memory of a death became a seed of existential fear. The campfire, in its warmth and light, created the psychological space for a new kind of burden to emerge, the burden of collective memory and shared anticipation. Did the comfort of the circle, paradoxically, give birth to the very anxieties it was meant to dispel? This ancient dynamic plays out with startling familiarity in our modern world, merely swapping the flicker of flame for the glow of screens. Social media platforms and 24-hour news cycles are the new campfires around which billions now huddle. The same oxytocin-driven mechanisms that once bound small tribes now operate on a global scale. A viral post about an impending crisis, a shared outrage over a distant injustice, a wave of panic buying triggered by a rumor, these are the modern equivalents of the startled gasp around the fire. The emotional contagion that researchers study in digital networks is precisely the same phenomenon that once swept through a band of hunter-gatherers. False information spreads not merely as a logical error, but as a visceral emotional wave, bypassing our critical faculties and speaking directly to the ancient, tribal parts of our brain that are wired to trust the fear of the group. The crowd panic in a packed stadium, the bank run triggered by whispers of instability, the digital mob forming in minutes, all are testament to the fact that our hyper-connected, technologically advanced brains are still running on a very old operating system, one that prioritizes social cohesion and rapid threat detection over cool, individual rationality. Have we, in our quest for global connection, simply built a planetary-scale amplifier for our most primal anxieties? This presents a profound paradox. The empathy that allows us to form compassionate societies, to care for the sick and the weak, and to build complex cultures based on trust, is the very same faculty that renders us exquisitely vulnerable. To be truly connected is to be open, and to be open is to be susceptible. In an environment saturated with the curated highlights of others' lives, we feel the pang of our own inadequacy. In a news cycle drenched in tragedy and conflict, we absorb a low-grade, persistent hum of despair. The emotional boundaries that might have protected an individual in a smaller, more immediate social group are porous in the face of a deluge of digital emotion. The strength of our tribal bond becomes the measure of our collective fragility. So, where does useful, bonding empathy end and debilitating pathological absorption begin? Is there a limit to how much of the world's suffering we are meant to feel before our own well-being fractures? If anxiety can indeed spread through a community like a pathogen, transmitted on the invisible vectors of shared attention and mirrored emotion, then what does that make our modern conduits of information? The campfire's circle was small, its stories tempered by the direct gaze and comforting touch of kin. Our new fires are vast, algorithmically stoked to maximize engagement, often feeding us a relentless diet of threat and outrage. They connect us, yet they can also isolate us in chambers of amplified fear. The negative emotion, then, is not merely a personal failing, but a social phenomenon, a ghost in the machine of human connection. And if that is so, who or what has become the chief storyteller, the most potent vector of this ancient collective worry in our time? Is the true predator we face today, not in the dark beyond the fire, but in the very nature of the flame itself? A single tear tracing a path down a human cheek is a quiet rebellion against the stoicism of the natural world. Why, among all creatures, are we alone in this? Why do we shed tears not just from physical pain, but from grief, from joy, from overwhelming beauty? It seems a paradox, this signal of weakness in a world that rewards strength, but perhaps the vulnerability is the point. A tear is more than a drop of saline. It is a biological white flag, a silent, shimmering plea. In a tribe where survival depended on cohesion, displaying absolute distress, the clenched jaw, the aggressive posture, could be misread as a threat. But tears disarm. They signal a different kind of need. I am overwhelmed. I am hurt. I am not a danger to you. Help me. This complex signal, born in the emotional crucible of the campfire, binds the group through a shared recognition of fragility. Could it be that our deepest strength as a species lies not in our individual might, but in this honest, glistening admission of our need for one another? The human infant enters the world as a paradox of vulnerability. It possesses no armor, no fangs, no swiftness of limb to escape danger. Its only defense is a sound, a piercing, insistent, and profoundly stressful wail. This cry, which can fray the nerves of the most patient adult, is not a flaw in our design. It is the very engine of our survival. Before language, before tool use, even before a focused gaze, there is the cry. It is a biological siren, a signal etched into our DNA that screams, "I am here, and I cannot survive alone." This primal sound, so often shushed and soothed into silence, is the first and most fundamental contract between the individual and the tribe. It is the acknowledgement that our existence is, from the very first breath, a collaborative act. The act of crying is one of our few truly innate reflexes. A newborn does not learn to cry. It arrives with the knowledge fully formed, a pre-programmed response to discomfort, hunger, or fear. These first tears are functional, lubricating the eyes, but they soon evolve into something uniquely human: emotional tears. Science tells us that these are chemically distinct from the tears shed while chopping an onion. They contain a cocktail of stress hormones and proteins, a literal release of internal pressure. But their purpose extends far beyond mere self-regulation. They are a signal flag, a visible, glistening testament to an internal state. When words fail or are deemed insufficient, tears speak a universal language. They blur the vision not to obscure the world, but to make the self more visible to others. In that moment of weeping, the body's internal storm is externalized, a silent plea written in salt water that asks for a hand to hold, an ear to listen, a presence to share the burden. If we could listen through the millennia, the soundscape of ancient communities would be punctuated by the communal sound of grief. While tears leave no fossil record, their echoes are preserved in the clay tablets of Babylon and the scrolls of ancient Greece. Here, crying was not a private shame but a public necessity. Professional mourners were hired to lead the lamentations at funerals, their orchestrated wails giving voice to the collective sorrow of a community. This was not mere performance. It was a vital social ritual. The shared act of crying bound people together, transforming individual loss into a communal experience. It was a way of saying, "Your pain is our pain. Your loss diminishes us all." In a world where survival was precarious, the cry for help, whether in the face of death, disaster, or threat, was a fundamental tool for rallying the tribe. The strength of the group was measured not just by its warriors, but by its capacity for collective empathy, a capacity activated by the sound of tears. Yet, in our modern age, we have built a world that increasingly muffles this ancient signal. We champion the virtues of stoicism and emotional control. Breathe through it, we are told. Stay calm. The ideal of our time is a state of unflappable composure. Consequently, crying has been pushed to the margins of acceptable behavior, relegated to the private, soundproofed spaces of our lives, the shower stall where water masks tears, the lonely car ride on a dark highway, the pillow swallowed by silence. We cry alone, believing our vulnerability to be a sign of weakness, a social liability. And yet, even in isolation, the body's ancient wisdom persists. The stress hormones are still flushed away, the emotional pressure valve still functions. The tear ducts obey a logic older than civilization, offering a physiological catharsis even when a social one is denied. This private weeping is a testament to a deep, unmet need, the need for a witness. This cultural suppression of tears invites a troubling question. If crying is a fundamental biological and social release valve, what is the cost of sealing it shut? Society, particularly in its expectations of masculinity, often teaches a simple, brutal lesson. Don't cry. We are conditioned to equate emotional expression with a loss of control, a descent into childishness. But could this very injunction be a silent contributor to the rising tides of internalized despair, of depression and suicide that plague our hyper-connected yet emotionally isolated world? When the natural signal for distress is systematically silenced, where does the pain go? It does not simply vanish. It turns inward, festering, seeking other, more destructive outlets. The refusal to allow tears may not build resilience, but rather a brittle fragility that can shatter under sufficient pressure. Is our cult of stoicism, then, not a strength, but a profound and collective weakness? So we arrive at a deeper understanding of the tear. It is more than a signal for help. It is a cry for the self, from the self. It is the body's way of forcing a confrontation with an emotion too large to contain. But this mechanism, perfected over eons of tribal living, depends on a responsive environment. The infant's cry is evolutionarily successful only if there is a caregiver to hear it. The mourner's wail is healing only if the community echoes it. The solitary tear in the car provides a chemical release, but it cannot offer the solace of a shared understanding. The most profound function of crying is not just the physiological purge, but the connection it seeks to forge. And this leads us to a final lingering thought. If the tear is a signal, what happens when the frequency on which it broadcasts is no longer monitored? When a society becomes too busy, too distracted, or too hardened to listen to the fundamental cries of its members, what becomes of the contract of mutual care that the first human cry established? Is the sound of a person crying alone the quietest and most tragic form of silence? And if we can no longer hear that signal, what other, more desperate signals might we be forced to confront? Perhaps the ability to truly hear the subtle tremors of fear in another's voice, to understand the unvoiced plea behind averted eyes, is the oldest form of intelligence. For in a tribe, the leader was not always the strongest, but often the one who could read the silent language of the group's anxieties. What kind of strength, then, is found not in the suppression of fear, but in the sensitivity to perceive it? In the deep, resonant silence before a storm, two figures stand at the edge of an ancient forest. One, muscles coiled like rope, grips a heavy club, his eyes fixed on the distant tree line, eager for the fight. The other stands slightly apart, his gaze not on a single point but sweeping the entire landscape, the shift in the wind, the sudden stillness of the birds, the scent of damp earth carried from miles away. He feels the coming danger not as a target, but as a change in the very texture of the air. When the threat finally emerges, the first man charges. The second had already begun moving the tribe to safety. Who, then, is the true leader? The story we often tell ourselves glorifies the club, the charge, the fearless hero. But what if the cradle of leadership was not forged in the heat of battle, but in the quiet, cold dread of anticipation? Our modern mythology of leadership is saturated with the image of fearlessness. We celebrate the visionary who seems immune to doubt, the charismatic figure whose unwavering confidence inspires legions. Yet, this image feels strangely incomplete, like a map with only the mountains charted and the valleys left blank. It ignores a fundamental biological truth etched into our very DNA: the capacity for fear, for anxiety, for a heightened sensitivity to threat is not a flaw in a leader's character. It is perhaps their most ancient and vital tool. This is not the paralyzing fear that freezes, but the anticipatory dread that calculates, plans, and sees the shadow of the tiger long before it breaks from the undergrowth. What if the first leader was not the strongest hunter, but the most watchful sentinel? At the most primal level, leadership and fear are entwined in a delicate dance of neurochemistry. Consider the individual with a highly sensitive nervous system, the one who, in psychological terms, might score high in neuroticism. Their internal world is a landscape of sharper contrasts where potential threats are amplified. An unexpected sound is not just a sound, it is a question mark that demands an immediate answer. Their amygdala, the brain's ancient alarm bell, has a lower threshold for ringing, flooding the body with cortisol and adrenaline at the slightest provocation. To an outsider, this person might seem merely anxious, burdened by a negativity bias. But from an evolutionary perspective, this system is not a design error. It is a sophisticated early warning mechanism for the collective. In a tribe surviving on the savannah, this individual's overreaction was a priceless asset. While the optimist might dismiss a rustle in the grass as the wind, the sensitive sentinel would tense, signaling the group to pause and assess. This hypervigilance, this constant scanning for deviation from the safe norm, provided a critical margin of survival. Their fear was not a private affliction, but a communal radar, a shared nervous system for the entire band. The leader who felt no fear would lead the tribe blindly into an ambush. The leader who felt fear too late would only be able to fight a losing battle. But the leader whose very constitution was tuned to the frequency of danger could steer the group away from the threat altogether. Is the true strength of a group, then, not measured by the courage of its boldest member, but by the sensitivity of its most cautious? This biological reality finds a silent, enduring testimony in the artifacts left by our ancestors. Deep within caves and on weathered stone, archaeologists have uncovered carvings and paintings that depict more than just the hunt. Alongside the triumphant images of speared bison, there are other, quieter figures. They are not depicted with weapons raised in victory, but often standing apart, on a high outcrop, a hand shading their eyes as they gaze toward the horizon. These are the watchers, the lookouts. Their power is not derived from the act of killing, but from the act of seeing. They are the ones who interpret the signs, who sense the shift in the animal migrations, who warn of a rival band's approach. This role was not one of passive anxiety, but of active, respected responsibility. The watcher's pronouncements would dictate the movement of the entire community, the timing of a hunt, the choice of a new campsite. Their authority came from a perceived connection to a deeper knowledge, an ability to read the invisible threads that connected the present to the future. They were the living embodiment of the proverb, "Forewarned is forearmed." Their value was in their perceived pessimism, their willingness to voice concerns that others, lost in the moment, might ignore. Does this ancient reverence for the watcher suggest that we have always, on some level, understood that the leader who sees the storm coming is more valuable than the one who simply knows how to weather it? The legacy of the watcher echoes powerfully in the modern halls of power, though we often fail to recognize it. Contemporary psychological research on leadership is gradually dismantling the cult of the fearless CEO. Studies of corporate teams, for instance, reveal that groups led by individuals who exhibit what is termed prudent anxiety often demonstrate greater long-term stability than those led by unflappable optimists. The leader who worries, who actively seeks out potential risks, who plays devil's advocate, who pressures tests every plan, does not create a culture of fear. Instead, they build a system that is resilient, adaptable, and prepared for uncertainty. These are the leaders who, during times of economic calm, are diligently stress testing their company's finances. They are the ones who invest in cybersecurity before a breach, who diversify supply chains before a disruption. Their negative emotions are not a hindrance, but the engine of a sophisticated risk management strategy. They carry the weight of potential futures so their team can focus on the present task. This is not the same as indecision or panic. It is the calculated, strategic application of concern. It is the modern equivalent of the sentinel on the cliff, interpreting the data on the horizon while others bask in the sun. In a world of increasing complexity and interconnected risks, could it be that the ability to fear intelligently is becoming the single most critical leadership skill? Yet this gift of foresight carries a profound and often hidden cost. The very neural pathways that make one an exceptional sentinel are a double-edged sword. The amygdala's alarm, so crucial for survival, does not distinguish between a genuine physical threat and a looming deadline, a negative quarterly report, or a sharp word from a colleague. For the modern leader, whose savannah is a boardroom or a virtual marketplace, the alarm bell rings constantly. The physiological toll is immense. Chronic stress, sleepless nights, a body perpetually poised for a fight that never physically arrives. The watcher on the cliff, forever scanning for storms, may eventually be worn down by the very winds they seek to predict. This is the central paradox of the sensitive leader. Their strength, their deep attunement to potential danger, is also their greatest vulnerability. The weight of what they see can become a crushing burden, where the fearless leader may be buoyed by a simple, unwavering belief in success. The watchful leader bears the heavy knowledge of everything that could go wrong. This can lead to exhaustion, to burnout, to a state where the constant background hum of anxiety drowns out the ability to inspire and motivate. The sentinel must eventually come down from the cliff and rest. But what happens when the threats are ceaseless and the watchtower has no door? Is the ultimate price of protecting the tribe the slow erosion of the protector's own spirit? And if this is the complex, paradoxical relationship between fear and leadership, a vital tool that can also be a slow poison, then where does that leave its quieter, more enduring cousin? If the sharp sting of fear helps the leader navigate immediate threats, what is the role of the deeper, slower current of sorrow? If the sentinel's anxiety is a map of future dangers, could the mourner's sadness be a map of past losses, a guide to what we must never forget? She has held the hands of the dying for a decade. She knows the precise weight of a silence that has just been emptied of a final breath. Her own body is healthy, strong, no physical scars mark her. Yet, one Tuesday morning, the simple act of brewing coffee becomes an impossible mountain. The world, once vivid, has been drained of its color, leaving only a pervasive, leaden gray. The diagnosis is not a virus or a malfunction, but a quiet erosion of the self. Secondary depression, a profound exhaustion born not from her own suffering, but from bearing witness to too much of it. This is the hidden cost of a virtue we hold sacred. This is the price of empathy. We are wired for connection, built with a biological apparatus designed to feel the world through others. Deep within the brain's intricate architecture lies the mirror neuron system, a silent, ceaselessly active network. It is the unseen stage where the dramas of those around us are performed as if they were our own. When we see a hand recoil from a hot surface, our own motor cortex flickers with a ghost of that movement. When we witness a face contort in grief, our own emotional centers echo that sorrow. This neural resonance is the cradle of compassion, the mechanism that allows a mother to soothe her child's pain instinctively, that allows a friend to genuinely share in our joy. It is the biological foundation of our humanity, the glue that binds societies. But what happens when this mirror becomes a prison, reflecting only anguish? When the system designed for brief, vital bursts of shared feeling is forced into a state of perpetual, screaming alert? The very mechanism that allows us to care becomes a conduit for a slow, insidious stress. The body cannot distinguish for long between a threat we see and a threat we own. The cortisol floods the system regardless. The heart rate elevates. The vigilant anxiety sets in. The tool for survival becomes a source of collapse. If empathy is a gift, why is its constant application so corrosive to the giver? Perhaps the answer is written not in our modern brains, but in our ancient bones. In a shallow grave, tens of thousands of years old, archaeologists uncovered the skeleton of an adult male. A healed fracture in his leg would have left him severely disabled, unable to hunt or keep pace with his nomadic group for many months. Yet he lived on, long enough for the bone to mend. He was fed, protected, and cared for by his people until the day he died. This prehistoric grave is a silent, powerful testament. Empathy is not a modern luxury or a cultural invention. It is an evolutionary strategy, as old as our species itself. In the brutal calculus of survival, the energy invested in one vulnerable individual must have been repaid by a stronger social unit, a more cohesive tribe. The ability to feel another's plight as our own ensured that the group would not abandon its weakest links, thereby strengthening the whole. This deep time perspective suggests that our capacity for care is fundamental, woven into the very fabric of what it means to be human. But that ancient social contract was likely negotiated within a small, intimate circle, a band of perhaps 50 or 100 individuals. The suffering was immediate, visceral, and often finite. The scale of our caring was meant to be local. Modernity has shattered that container. The teacher in a crowded classroom, attuned to the silent distress of 30 different children, each carrying invisible burdens from broken homes and digital anxieties. The social worker navigating an endless caseload of human crises. The humanitarian aid worker whose screen floods with images of suffering from across the globe. They are asked to hold an empathy that is both vast and abstract, stretched over a canvas of millions. This is the breeding ground for a distinctly modern affliction: compassion fatigue. It is a state of emotional, physical, and spiritual exhaustion that reduces our ability to empathize. It is not a sign of weakness or a moral failing. It is the predictable burnout of a neurological system pushed far beyond its evolutionary design specifications. The heart, it seems, has a finite capacity for intentional sorrow. The well of compassion can run dry. And so we arrive at a painful paradox. The very quality that makes us most human contains the seeds of our own depletion. We are built to care, but not, it seems, to care this much, for this many. This leads us to a difficult, almost heretical question. If empathy is a core part of being human, why does it wound us so deeply? Is it possible that the pain we feel is not a flaw, but a feature? A biological stop sign, a hard limit imposed by nature that we, in our hyper-connected world, consistently ignore? We valorize self-sacrifice. We celebrate those who give until they have nothing left. We call it being too good. But what if this relentless empathy is a form of physiological trespass? We would not expect an arm to lift a weight indefinitely without tearing a muscle. Why do we expect the emotional self to endure an endless burden of shared pain without fracturing? The boundary between virtuous compassion and self-destructive enmeshment becomes blurred. Where does one person's suffering end and another's begin when our neural wiring insists they are the same? When the negative emotion is born from a place of profound goodness, where does the balance lie? Is the goal to build higher walls to protect ourselves, or to find a way to keep the heart open without letting it bleed out? And in this economy of feeling, can an emotion like sadness, even a debilitating one, be transformed? Could it be, in its most extreme form, not a breakdown, but a desperate biological strategy for survival? A forced retreat, mandated by a brain that knows, on some primal level, that to continue is to risk total annihilation. If empathy's cost is a collapse into silence, what if that silence is not an empty void, but a deep, necessary recalibration? What if the darkness is not the enemy, but the soil? The man lost his job. One day, he is a functioning part of the economic machine. The next, He is a component deemed surplus to requirements. The logical next step, the one expected by friends, family, and the silent, judging clock on the wall, is to update the resume, to network, to push forward. But he does not. He retreats to the dim sanctuary of his bedroom, the weight of the duvet a more tangible reality than the abstract concept of a future. Appetite vanishes. Food becomes ash. Conversation is a distant shore. From the outside, it looks like a collapse, a failure of will, a weakness. But what if we are misreading the signals? What if this profound shutdown is not a system failure, but the activation of a deeply archaic, brutal form of intelligence? What if the brain, faced with an untenable situation, a path forward that promises only further depletion and danger, chooses to pull a master switch? It doesn't fight. It doesn't flee. It freezes. It conserves. It is a biological white flag, a strategic surrender not to an external enemy, but to the internal calculus of energy expenditure. Could it be that depression, in its primordial form, is not a bug, but a feature? A desperate ancient mechanism for survival? This idea begins not in the therapist's office, but in the harsh classrooms of evolution. Some evolutionary psychologists propose that depression is a conservation withdrawal response, an adaptation sculpted by millennia of scarcity and threat. Imagine our early ancestors on the savannah. An individual suffers a significant loss, the death of a key ally, a defeat in a social hierarchy, a debilitating but non-fatal injury. To continue expending precious calories on ambitious, outward-focused goals would be maladaptive, even suicidal. The body, in its profound wisdom, forces a retreat. It drastically lowers metabolism. It curtails motivation. It induces a state of profound introspection and emotional anesthesia. This is not laziness. It is a forced hibernation of the spirit. The brain, in its own cryptic language, is executing a command. Cease all non-essential operations. Hoard your resources. The world outside is currently lethal. The very symptoms we pathologize, lethargy, anhedonia, the inability to feel pleasure, social withdrawal, begin to look like a sophisticated, if brutal, energy-saving protocol. Is the soul then subject to the same brutal accounting as the body? We can find echoes of this potential purpose if we listen to the whispers from our deep past, to the rhythms of hunter-gatherer societies. In such groups, an individual who was wounded or sick was not simply left behind. There was often an understood period of withdrawal. The injured party would retreat from the daily hunt, from the intense social chatter, and be cared for in quiet. This involuntary convalescence provided a biological timeout, a space for healing not just physical wounds, but psychic ones. The social structure accommodated this rhythm of engagement and retreat. The individual's low mood signaled a need for community support, and the community, in turn, provided it. In this context, a depressive-like state was a communicative tool, a non-verbal way of saying, "I am compromised. I need to step back." It was a temporary state within a cycle of life that understood fallowness as a necessary prelude to regeneration. Was depression, then, once a social signal that our modern world has forgotten how to decode? There are intriguing, albeit tentative observations in our modern world that hint at this latent functionality. Cases of mild to moderate depression sometimes resolve after a period of deep enforced rest, a sabbatical, a severance period spent away from the grind, without any pharmaceutical intervention. It is as if the system, given the very shutdown it was demanding, finally completes its diagnostic cycle and reboots. The individual emerges, not necessarily euphoric, but clearer, with a realigned sense of priority. The problem is that our industrialized, hyperstimulated society has surgically removed the space for this kind of emotional hibernation. There is no sanctioned season of sorrow. The machinery must not stop. We are expected to grieve on weekends and process profound disorientation during our lunch breaks. The very environment that might allow an adaptive depressive response to run its natural course, one of quiet, support, and time, has been paved over by the demands of perpetual productivity. So, when the ancient mechanism fires, it finds no safe container. The withdrawal has no end date. The conservation of energy becomes a slow leak into a void. Has civilization, in its relentless forward march, pathologized a necessary pause? Yet, this theory of depression as a useful mechanism reaches its limits when confronted with the raw, devastating reality of severe clinical depression. This is not a thoughtful retreat. It is a siege. It is a state where the conservation of energy becomes so extreme that the will to live itself is extinguished. The mechanism breaks the organism it was designed to protect. The brain's safe mode becomes a permanent, inescapable prison. The body refuses to move. The mind turns into a chamber of horrors, replaying failures and imagining futures of unending pain. Here, the analogy to an adaptive response shatters. This is not a strategic shutdown, it is a system-wide catastrophe. This forces an uncomfortable, almost heretical question. Is the problem a faulty brain, a mechanism that has spiraled into a destructive feedback loop? Or is the problem a world so profoundly mismatched to our ancient neural wiring that what was once a life-saving response is now triggered by stimuli for which it is utterly unsuited? The brain's alarm system, designed to respond to a predator's snarl or the sight of a barren landscape, is now activated by an email from a boss, a dip in the stock market, a perceived social slight on a screen. The response is the same, full-scale retreat. But the threat is chronic, abstract, and inescapable. There is no predator to outlast, no season to wait out. Just the constant, low-grade hum of existential threat. The mechanism, once a precise tool, has become a blunt instrument, beating its owner into submission. Is severe depression, then, a sane reaction to an insane world? Or is it the ultimate proof of our biological fragility? If we tentatively accept that depression might have roots in an ancient conservation strategy, a stark paradox emerges. A mechanism that once served to preserve life in a world of immediate physical dangers has become a source of immense suffering in a world of abstract psychological ones. The very thing that might have saved us on the savannah can destroy us in the suburb. The cradle of forced introspection becomes a club of self-annihilation. The adaptation is obsolete, a vestigial tale on the psyche, but one that still has the power to paralyze. This transformation raises a deeper, more unsettling possibility. What happens when this raw biological experience is no longer just felt, but is named, examined, and woven into the story a culture tells about itself? What occurs when sadness is given a language? This question leads us away from the biology of the individual and into the dawn of recorded thought, to the river valleys where civilization first learned to write its fears and its sorrows onto clay. In Mesopotamia, emotion began its journey from a private storm to a public text. It was in the Epic of Gilgamesh, grieving the death of his friend Enkidu, that we see a profound, documented human sadness. It was no longer just a physiological state. It was a theme, a subject for poetry, a force that could shape a hero's journey. The internal mechanism of conservation withdrawal met the external technology of writing. The groan of the soul found an alphabet. So, if depression is a silent, biological script written in the ancient language of survival, what happens when civilization begins to write back? When the unspoken ache is given a name, does it become easier to bear, or does the name itself become a new kind of cage? Does the act of writing down our sadness transform it from a mechanism we are into a story we tell? The oldest written object we possess from the world's first civilization is not a tax record, a king's decree, or a recipe for beer. It is a small, cracked tablet of Sumerian clay inscribed with a lament. It speaks not of gods or glory, but of a private, intimate weight, a heavy heart. For over 4,000 years, this poetic fragment has endured, a testament to the fact that one of humanity's earliest acts of recorded thought was to give voice to sorrow. Before we fully mastered writing to build empires, we used it to describe the weather inside us. This suggests a profound truth about our species. Civilization and sadness may have been born together, two sides of the same clay coin. What happens inside a brain when it becomes capable of holding a feeling and observing that feeling at the same time? This is the leap into metacognition, the ability to think about our own thinking. For an animal, fear is an immediate, all-consuming signal. Run. Sadness might be a withdrawal, a quieting. But for a human, sadness is not just the raw feeling. It is the awareness of being sad. It is the thought, I am sad, which then loops back to color the sadness with layers of meaning, memory, and anticipation. This self-reflective capacity, which blossomed fully in Homo sapiens, transforms simple emotion into complex sentiment. The heavy heart is not just a physiological state, it is a narrated experience. The brain becomes both the stage and the critic, the feeling and the story about the feeling. In this internal theater, sadness is no longer a passing storm. It becomes a climate, a landscape that the mind can wander through, mapping its contours and naming its shadows. Does this very act of observation, this turning of the lens inward, amplify the whisper of sorrow into a voice that echoes in the chambers of the self? This internal echo needed an external vessel. With the invention of writing in the fertile crescents of Mesopotamia and the valleys of the Nile and the Yellow River, humanity found that vessel. The archaeological record is strikingly consistent on this point. Across these nascent civilizations, amidst the administrative lists and the hymns to deities, we find the indelible ink of human suffering. A Mesopotamian psalm pleads with a goddess for solace from a world filled with injustice and personal misery. An Egyptian official's tomb inscription speaks of the weariness of life and the futility of earthly striving. Early Chinese poetry from the Shijing, Book of Songs, is saturated with the melancholy of parting lovers, the grief of soldiers, and the loneliness of the displaced. This was not merely the recording of emotion, it was its objectification. By inscribing sadness onto clay or papyrus, it was as if people could take the turbulent private chaos within and lay it down outside themselves to be held, seen, and perhaps understood. The emotion was given a shape and a permanence it never had before. Was this the moment sadness ceased to be a fleeting individual burden and became a shared cultural artifact, a thread connecting hearts across millennia? This ancient impulse to externalize our inner world remains our primary tool for navigating emotional turmoil today. The modern diary, the confessional poem, the heart-wrenching novel, these are the direct descendants of the Sumerian lament. In the act of writing, we perform a kind of alchemy. We translate the nebulous, painful stuff of feeling into the structured order of language. We create a narrative around our pain, and in doing so, we often seem to gain a measure of control over it. The chaos is given a plot. We can step back and see our sadness as a story, one with a beginning and, hopefully, a middle that leads to an end. This process can be profoundly healing, a way to metabolize experience and find meaning in suffering. But this same act of preservation carries a hidden cost. The notebook that contains our grief also becomes a museum for it. The poem that captures a moment of despair can, upon rereading, become a portal that transports us back to that precise shade of anguish. Have we, in our quest to understand and manage our sadness, also invented the perfect tool for its curation and reanimation? Does the written word, intended to be a release, sometimes become the most elegant of prisons? This paradox lies at the heart of our relationship with negative emotions. Giving a name to a feeling, describing it in vivid detail, and even elevating it into art, can validate our experience and connect us to others. It says, "You are not alone in this." This act of naming can strip a feeling of its terrifying anonymity, making it manageable. Yet, in the very act of meticulously describing our sorrow, are we also polishing it, granting it a significance and a permanence it might otherwise have lacked? Does the artistic celebration of melancholy, from ancient laments to modern blues, encourage us to cling to our suffering as a source of identity? Is there a danger that we can become connoisseurs of our own pain, curating it so carefully that we forget how to let it go? The same tool that liberates can also entrap, depending on the hand that wields it and the intention behind the gaze. When a feeling is confined to a single skull, it is a solitary event. But when it is translated into words and shared, it escapes its biological confines and enters the ecosystem of culture. The Sumerian heavy heart, once written down, was no longer just one person's burden. It became an idea available to all. It became a symbol that others could recognize within themselves, a shared reference point for human vulnerability. And from this shared recognition, emotion transforms into something else entirely, an instrument. A leader can harness collective sadness to unite a people against a perceived loss. A prophet can channel shared anxiety to prescribe a new moral order. A poet can articulate a generation's disillusionment, giving it a voice and a direction. The private ache, once made public, becomes a force that can bind communities together or tear them apart. It becomes a currency of influence, a lever that can move the human spirit. If sadness can be woven into the fabric of a society's story about itself, then who gets to hold the loom? And so, we are left with the silent testimony of that first clay tablet. It tells us that from the very beginning, to be civilized was to be conscious of our own sorrow and to feel compelled to speak it into the world. This act defined us, but it also set in motion a chain of consequences we are still navigating. We learned to hold our heaviness in our hands, to give it form, and in doing so, we gave it a life of its own. The story of sadness is, therefore, not just a story of biology or individual psychology, but a story of power. And if the first civilizations taught us how to write our grief, did they also, unknowingly, teach us how to wield it? This question hangs in the air, as palpable as the dust of ancient cities, leading our gaze forward to another tomb, another ruler, another kind of pain that transcended the merely emotional. For what happens when the heavy heart belongs not to a common scribe, but to a god-king, a pharaoh whose very body was a testament to the intimate physical consequences of absolute power? The golden funerary mask of Tutankhamun stares out across 3 millennia, its gaze serene, its features idealized in the immutable perfection of beaten gold. It is the face of a god-king, an absolute ruler whose word was law and whose divinity was woven into the very fabric of the universe. For centuries, this mask was the only truth we knew. It spoke of untouchable power, of a life elevated so far above the mundane as to be immune to the frailties that plague ordinary mortals. But then, in the dim light of his rediscovered tomb, a different truth emerged, not from the glittering artifacts, but from the silent skeleton of the boy king himself. He was just 19. Modern analysis of his remains paints a portrait starkly at odds with the golden icon. His body was a catalogue of suffering, a cleft palate, a clubfoot, a spine twisted by scoliosis. The malaria parasite, Plasmodium falciparum, was found preserved in his tissues, suggesting recurrent, debilitating fevers that would have racked his fragile frame. The final blow was likely a severe compound fracture in his left leg, which, compounded by his compromised immune system, turned necrotic. We can, with clinical precision, list the biological failures that led to his death, but the science only illuminates the surface of the darkness. What truly killed Tutankhamun may have been something even more invisible, a ghost in the machine of his power, a profound and isolating loneliness, a body steeped in constant unease. The first layer of this truth is written in his very DNA. Genetics has revealed Tutankhamun as a tragic product of a royal lineage that sought to preserve its purity by closing in upon itself. He was the son of siblings, a consequence of pharaohs marrying pharaohs to keep the divine bloodline undiluted. This practice, intended to concentrate power, instead concentrated a cascade of hereditary disorders. The same genetic code that granted him divinity also cursed him with a body that was, in fundamental ways, broken. From the perspective of evolutionary psychology, the psychological impact of this would have been profound, even within the protective cocoon of the palace. In a society that prized physical perfection as a sign of divine favor, a pharaoh who limped, who perhaps needed a cane to stand upright, of which several were found in his tomb, would have been a walking contradiction. The god was imperfect. The living symbol of Egypt's strength was, in private, weak and pained. The adulation of the courtiers, the prostrations of the priests, could they have masked their pity or, worse, their doubt? The body, in its persistent failure, can become a prison of the mind, a constant, whispering reminder of inadequacy that no amount of external power can fully silence. This internal suffering leaves its own archaeological record, not in bones, but in symbols. The elaborate funerary texts that guided pharaohs to the afterlife, like the Book of the Dead, are often misread as mere magical incantations. Look closer. They are saturated with a deep, palpable melancholy. There are lamentations for the loss of the sun, fears of oblivion, and pleas for protection against cosmic loneliness. The god Osiris, the central figure of the resurrection cycle, is not just a god of the dead. He is a god who was murdered by his own brother, dismembered, and then reassembled. His story is one of profound betrayal, trauma, and a hard-won, fragmented wholeness. This was the archetype offered to a dead pharaoh. These were not just religious formulae. They were the first civilization's sophisticated toolkit for processing the mental anguish of its most powerful individuals. They acknowledged that even a god-king, on his journey through the Duat, the underworld, would be gripped by fear, sorrow, and a longing for the world of the living. The rituals were a script for navigating a psychological crisis as much as a spiritual one. In the quiet of the burial chamber, surrounded by unimaginable wealth, the final companion was, inevitably, a deep and ancient sadness. And this is not an artifact confined to antiquity. The modern pharaohs, the celebrities, the billionaires, the tech titans who wield godlike influence over global culture and economies inhabit a similarly rarefied atmosphere. Yet their biographies are often case studies in a familiar despair. The statistics are stark. Higher rates of depression, addiction, and suicide among the ultra-successful. The very isolation that power creates, the sycophants who replace friends, the constant scrutiny that erodes privacy, the pressure to maintain an image of infallibility, becomes a petri dish for negative emotions. The death of a star, by overdose or their own hand, sends a shockwave precisely because it shatters the illusion that their success granted them immunity. It reveals the universal vulnerability of the human psyche. The throne, whether it is made of gold or stock options, offers no protection from the storms within. The emotion, it seems, does not discriminate based on status. It flows upwards just as easily as it trickles down, a great leveler of human experience. This leads to a troubling counterpoint, a question that undermines our most basic social contracts. If vast wealth and absolute power are insufficient shields, if they can, in fact, amplify the very feelings they are supposed to vanquish, then what social construct does offer immunity? Is there any tool, any achievement, any fortress of the human spirit that can reliably keep sadness at bay? We build our lives around the pursuit of security, status, and comfort, operating on the implicit assumption that these things will buffer us against pain. Yet the evidence from a pharaoh's tomb to a celebrity's mansion suggests this may be a fundamental miscalculation. The pursuit itself might be a beautifully decorated gilded cage, distracting us from a more essential truth about the architecture of our own minds. When sorrow is present in the hovel and the palace, when it visits the peasant and the god-king with equal force, perhaps it is not a flaw in the individual's life design, nor a simple chemical imbalance to be corrected. Perhaps it is something far more foundational, a structural feature of consciousness itself. It is not a bug, but a terrifying, intrinsic part of the program. But if that is the case, if this capacity for profound sadness is woven into the very fabric of what we are, what purpose could it possibly serve? What deep, ancient function does it fulfill within the dark, silent theater of the skull? This question lingers, pulling our gaze back, further back, beyond the glitter of dynastic Egypt, to a time before pyramids pierced the sky, to a different kind of skull entirely, a heavy, robust skull with a low brow and vast sinus cavities, belonging to a species that walked the earth long before the first pharaoh conceived of his divinity. What traces of sorrow might we find etched into the bone of a Neanderthal? At a dig site in northern Spain, the dust settles not on bone, but on a question. The Neanderthal skull, cradled carefully from the earth, is notable not just for its heavy brow and robust structure, but for an unusual expansion in the frontal region, a contour that suggests to the trained eye of a paleoanthropologist a well-developed seat of emotion. Here, in the silent architecture of a cranium that last held thought 40,000 years ago, lies a hint of a profound interiority. Could this being, so often caricatured as a brutish creature of the Ice Age, have known the slow, heavy weight of sorrow? Could a Neanderthal have gazed at a setting sun over a frozen plain and felt not just the cold, but a chill of a different, more internal kind? This single fossil becomes a portal, not just into a past world, but into the deep, evolutionary history of a feeling we consider uniquely human. The biological evidence is compelling, written in the calcium poetry of the bone itself. Neanderthals possessed a brain volume that was, on average, equivalent to or even slightly larger than that of our own Homo sapiens ancestors. But size is a crude metric. The true story is in the subtleties of the landscape within. Endocasts, impressions of the brain taken from the inside of the skull, suggest a significant development in the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. These are the ancient, intertwined centers of our own emotional lives. The amygdala, a deep-seated alarm system and wellspring of primal fear and attachment, and the prefrontal cortex, which helps regulate, interpret, and give context to those raw signals. This neural hardware implies a capacity for complex social bonding, for empathy, for a nuanced understanding of the emotional states of others within a group. It is the physical substrate for a mind that could not only feel, but feel for another. Was this neural configuration the cradle of a shared emotional heritage, a common biological language of the heart that pulsed in two different kinds of human? Archaeology adds flesh and blood to the skeletal blueprint. Scattered across Europe and the Near East are sites that speak of more than mere survival. At Shanidar Cave in Iraq, the skeleton of an old male nicknamed Shanidar I tells a story of a hard life, a crippling arm injury, blindness in one eye, and other deformities that would have made him a severe liability for a band of hunter-gatherers. Yet he lived to a ripe old age. He was cared for, fed, and protected for years, perhaps decades. This is not the action of a species driven solely by ruthless pragmatism. It is an act of compassion, a recognition of value beyond physical utility. Elsewhere, at sites like La Chapelle-aux-Saints in France, we find what appear to be intentional burials. Bodies placed carefully in pits, sometimes accompanied by a simple tool or a sprinkling of ochre pigment. These are not acts of disposal, but rituals. They suggest a pause, a ceremony, a collective acknowledgement of a life ended. They hint at a concept of an afterlife, or at the very least a profound respect for the dead that transcends the immediate moment. Is this the fossilized evidence of grief? A silent testament to the ache of absence, to the first time a group of humans stood around a grave and felt the hollowing wind of loss? Modern neuroscience brings this ancient capacity into sharp, poignant focus. When we slide a living Homo sapiens into an fMRI scanner and ask them to recall a personal loss, the death of a loved one, the end of a relationship, the sting of profound isolation, we see a specific pattern of light. The very same regions that were prominent in the Neanderthal brain, the amygdala flashing with raw distress, the prefrontal cortex laboring to make sense of the pain, illuminate our own. The neural pathways of sadness appear to be deeply conserved, a shared inheritance. The feeling that crumples a modern human in a subway car or a quiet bedroom is, in its essential mechanics, the same feeling that might have visited a Neanderthal watching the last embers of a fire die out in a dark cave. This continuity is startling. It suggests that sorrow is not a modern invention, a byproduct of civilization's complexities, but a fundamental thread in the fabric of our being, woven into us over hundreds of thousands of years of social living. If the capacity for such deep emotion was present in a parallel lineage of humanity, what does that say about its evolutionary purpose? Is it merely a flaw, a side effect of intelligence, or does it serve a function so vital that it was sculpted by natural selection in more than one human species? This very question leads to a troubling paradox, a shadow in the narrative of shared feeling. If Neanderthals possessed the neural architecture for empathy, grief, and complex social bonds, if they were, in a sense, our emotional equals, then what led to their extinction while our own ancestors thrived and spread across the globe? Could the very depth of their emotional capacity have been a liability? Perhaps their social groups were smaller, tighter, more intensely bonded, making them less able to form the large, flexible networks that characterized Homo sapiens. Did a deeper, more paralyzing grief at the loss of a group member hinder their resilience? Or was their empathy more localized, less easily extended to strangers, limiting their ability to innovate through cultural exchange? The question turns our assumption about emotion on its head. We often view compassion and sadness as hallmarks of our humanity, but in the brutal arithmetic of survival, could they have been a weakness for one branch of the human family? Is it possible that the price of survival was a certain emotional pragmatism, a capacity to move on from loss with a speed that a Neanderthal mind, perhaps more deeply feeling, could not muster? The persistence of sadness across evolutionary time, from a parallel branch of humanity to our own, suggests it is far more than a biological accident. It appears to be a core feature of the human operating system, an intrinsic part of having a large, socially complex brain. It is the tax we pay for love, for attachment, for the bonds that have allowed us to survive. But this raises a final, more intricate question. What happens when this ancient emotional brain, this legacy of the Neanderthals and beyond, develops a new layer? What occurs when the brain evolves not just the capacity to feel sadness, but the capacity to stand outside of it, to observe its own suffering? When the mind becomes a theater, and the self becomes both the actor and the audience, watching the play of its own emotions from a shadowy seat in the back. For Homo sapiens, a crucial evolutionary development was the refinement of a network of brain regions known as the default mode network. This is the circuitry that lights up when we are not focused on the outside world, but are turned inward. It is the engine of self-referential thought, of mental time travel. It allows us to vividly relive a painful memory from the past while simultaneously projecting ourselves into an anxious future where that pain might be repeated. This ability to hold the past and the future in the present moment is the seed of something new, something beyond primal sadness. It is the birthplace of existential anxiety, of a unique and haunting human awareness. The knowledge that we are fragile, that loss is inevitable, and that we are ultimately alone inside our own skulls. The Neanderthal may have felt the storm of grief, but did they also feel the quiet, lingering dread of the calm that follows, the dread of knowing another storm will come? If the ancient shared sadness is the first layer of the soul, then this self-aware consciousness is the wall built around it, a wall that both protects and isolates. What happens when the mind, having inherited the deep emotional soul of its cousins, begins to contemplate its own confines? You are walking down a quiet street, the afternoon sun dappling through the leaves. There is no danger here, no urgent task. The air is calm, and then, without warning, it arrives. A memory, sharp and precise. A mistake you made 8 years ago. The heat of shame floods your cheeks as if the event were happening now, in this peaceful moment. No one summoned it. No external trigger pulled its thread. So why? Why does the mind, in its quietest hours, choose to open this particular door? Why does it hand you a cup of poison when you were only asking for a glass of water? This is the work of the walled garden of the mind, a place where the past is not a fossil, but a living, breathing entity. The The gatekeeper is not a conscious choice, but a network of neurons that flickers to life precisely when we think we are doing nothing at all. Neuroscientists have mapped this territory, naming it the default mode network. It is the brain's background hum, its idle engine. When the demands of the external world fade, when you are not solving a math problem or navigating traffic, this intricate web of regions deep within the cortex ignites. It is the seat of self-referential thought, the projector that casts films of your past and scripts of your possible futures onto the private screen of your consciousness. Here, in this neural theater, you rehearse conversations that never happened and relive moments you wish had not. The default mode network is the architect of regret, the weaver of narratives where you are both the hero and the fool. It is the biological cradle of that sudden, unbidden memory, a system designed not for torment, but for meaning-making. But what is the meaning of a pain recalled in safety? To understand this peculiar machinery, we might look back, far beyond the reach of written history, to a world written in stone and survival. For our ancestors, a mind that wandered was not a mind adrift. It was a mind at work. The sharp sting of failure, the near miss with a predator, the poisonous berry, the social misstep that led to exile, needed to be branded into memory with the hot iron of emotion. Sadness, regret, and shame were not mere feelings. They were sophisticated data storage systems. In the absence of written language, an emotional charge was the most effective way to ensure a lesson was not forgotten. The brain, in its ancient wisdom, learned to sear important information into the neural pathways with the acid of negative experience. To feel bad about a past action was to increase the odds of survival. The mind's tendency to revisit these moments during periods of rest, safe in a cave or sheltered in a tree, was a form of nocturnal practice, a way of sharpening the spear of instinct for the next day's hunt. The pain was the price of the lesson. But what happens when the lessons are learned and the pain keeps coming? Has the student surpassed the teacher, only to find the teacher won't leave the classroom? This ancient survival mechanism, once a lifeline, has become a potential snare in the modern world. The cave has been replaced by the commute, the silent watch by the scrolling screen. Yet, the default mode network continues its tireless work. Studies suggest that the modern human mind spends up to 47% of its waking hours adrift in this state of mind wandering. And this journey is not a pleasant vacation. The destination is most often a landscape of negative thought. We ruminate on slights, catastrophize about deadlines, and replay our embarrassments on a loop. This constant internal narration, divorced from immediate physical danger, is now understood to be a significant contributor to the modern plagues of anxiety and depression. The very system that once ensured our survival by making us remember a single cliff edge now forces us to walk along 1,000 imaginary ones every day. The mechanism designed to protect the tribe by enforcing social cohesion now isolates us within a prison of our own self-criticism. Is this a design flaw? A cruel bug in our cognitive software? Or is it a masterpiece of evolutionary engineering that has simply found itself in the wrong century, like a master carpenter equipped with only a stone axe in a world of steel? Perhaps it is neither flaw nor perfection, but something more fluid, a mechanism out of context. The brain's habit of using downtime for emotional maintenance is not an error. The error may lie in the environment we have built for it, an environment of constant low-grade stimulation that never allows for true digestion, only endless consumption. The mind tries to process the unresolved conflicts of a hyper-connected life with the same tools it used to process the memory of a tiger's roar. The result is a chronic, low-grade inflammation of the psyche. The wall of the mind, once a sturdy barrier against external threats, has turned inward, its stones now forming the walls of a labyrinth we navigate in the dark. If the mind is so adept at recalling sadness, is it not also capable of change? Can the very walls that confine us be reshaped by a different environment, by a different kind of connection? To explore this possibility, we must look at what happens when the most powerful force in the human experience crashes against this wall. What happens when we fall in love? Love, in its initial dizzying stages, seems to silence the default mode network. The constant chatter of the self, the regrets, the projections, the self-criticism, is momentarily hushed. The world narrows to a single point of light. But this quiet is an illusion. The biochemical systems that love engages are among the most potent and addictive the brain can produce. Dopamine, the molecule of desire, creates a relentless craving for the beloved, building a pathway of anticipation and reward that mirrors the circuitry of drug addiction. Oxytocin, the hormone of bonding, weaves a sense of deep trust and attachment, convincing us that this person is our safe harbor. In this state, the beloved becomes the new center of the universe, and the mind's wandering thoughts are happily tethered to their presence. The wall seems to dissolve. We feel known, understood, finally free from the prison of ourselves. Yet, this is where the trapdoor opens. For if love is a biochemical state of attachment and addiction, then loss, betrayal, or even the simple, slow fading of passion becomes a form of withdrawal. The very neural pathways that once lit up with bliss now scream with absence. The mind wandering that love temporarily suspended returns with a vengeance, but now its content is singular and agonizing. It replays every moment, searches for every clue, and aches with a pain that is both emotional and physical. The brain registers the loss of a loved one in the same regions that process physical pain. A heartbreak is not a metaphor. The wall of the mind, which seemed to have fallen, was merely being patrolled by a new guard. When that guard leaves its post, the old inhabitants, the regrets, the insecurities, the ancient pains, come flooding back, often amplified by the new raw wound of loss. Love does not dismantle the wall. It merely paints a beautiful mural on it, making us forget the stone beneath. And when the paint fades, the wall remains, colder and more imposing than before. So we are left with a paradox. The mind's machinery for learning through pain, essential for our ancestors, now haunts our peace. And love, which promises an escape from the self, ultimately rewires that same self for a new kind of suffering. The systems are linked, one feeding into the other. The default mode. Network that dredges up old regrets is the same network that will later agonize over a lost love, turning the beloved into just another lesson, seared into the brain with the acid of experience. We are caught between an ancient biology that insists on learning through pain and a modern consciousness that yearns for uninterrupted peace. Is the wall of the mind, then, our protector or our jailer? Can the mural ever become the wall itself? The ache begins not in the heart, but in the body. A tightness in the chest that makes each breath a conscious effort. A hollow feeling in the stomach that turns food to ash. Nights spent staring at the ceiling, the mind replaying a single moment on an endless, torturous loop. To a person in the throes of a breakup, these sensations feel uniquely personal, a testament to the depth of their loss. But if we could slide them into an fMRI scanner and peer at the landscape of their brain, we would see a different, more universal story unfolding. The neural pathways lighting up with the fire of withdrawal are startlingly familiar. They are the same circuits that scream in the silence of a cocaine addict's detox. This is the central, unsettling paradox. Is love a medicine, a necessary sustenance for the human soul? Or is it, in its own exquisite way, a poison? The line between the two may be the thinnest of all. The biology of love is a story of chemical dependency, written in the ancient language of our reward system. At its core is dopamine, the molecule of wanting, of pursuit, of focused anticipation. When we are falling in love, this system is not merely activated, it is hijacked. Every text message notification becomes a potential jackpot, every memory a hit of pure euphoria. The brain's ventral tegmental area goes into overdrive, flooding the nucleus accumbens, the seat of craving, with a neurotransmitter cocktail that screams more. This is not the placid chemistry of long-term attachment, of oxytocin's warm embrace. This is the frantic, obsessive engine of romantic infatuation, a state neurologically indistinguishable from a compulsive drive. It is a survival mechanism, honed over millennia, designed to ensure we pursue a mate with the same single-minded intensity we would reserve for finding water in a desert. But what happens when the well runs dry? The withdrawal is a physiological revolt. The dopamine spigot is turned off, and the brain, which had recalibrated its entire economy around this abundant supply, plunges into deficit. The craving remains, a ghost limb of connection, but the reward is gone. The insomnia, the anxiety, the inability to feel pleasure in anything else. These are not signs of weakness, but the standard symptoms of a system in crisis. The body is not mourning a person. It is screaming for its fix. So, if love is a natural state, why does its absence mimic a pathology? Is the very circuitry that binds us also a built-in instrument of our own torture? This dance of agony and ecstasy is not a modern invention. Long before neuroscience, our ancestors were carving their own understanding of this bond into stone and burying it with their dead. In an archaeological site in northern Italy, the skeletons of a young man and woman were discovered locked in an embrace that has lasted for 6,000 years. Their arms are wrapped around each other, their faces turned towards one another, a silent, Stone Age testament to a connection that even death could not sever. In caves across Europe, prehistoric artists left handprints, often a smaller one nestled within a larger one, or figures with exaggerated heart-shaped bodies. These are not just symbols of fertility or clan affiliation. They feel like intimacies frozen in time. They suggest that the experience of pair bonding, of a specific individualized love that transcended the mere mechanics of reproduction, was a profound part of the human story from the very beginning. This deep history reframes the pain of loss. It is not a contemporary malady of oversensitive souls, but an ancient, intrinsic cost of a connection that, for whatever evolutionary reason, we decided was worth the risk. The shared grave is a monument not just to love, but to the vulnerability it creates. What does it mean that our species has, for millennia, chosen to build its future on a foundation that guarantees such profound personal devastation? In our hyper-connected present, the ancient pain of heartbreak has found new and potent amplifiers. Psychological studies consistently identify romantic breakup as a primary trigger for major depressive episodes in young adults. But where once the physical world offered a natural salve, distance, the gradual fading of shared spaces, the digital world now ensures the wound is perpetually reopened. Social media creates a panopticon of pain. The algorithm, indifferent to suffering, serves up memories, a photograph from a happy anniversary, a song shared. It offers a window into an ex-partner's life, a curated highlight reel that seems to scream of a moving on that is faster, happier, and more complete than our own. This constant, low-grade re-exposure is a form of psychological torture, preventing the neural pathways from going quiet, from learning that the reward is truly gone. The recovery process, which once had a rhythm of its own, is now stalled, stretched into a protracted state of anxious vigilance. The community that might have once gathered to support an individual is now often the very platform that exacerbates their isolation, turning a private grief into a publicly performed spectacle. If the brain's withdrawal is a natural process, have we built an environment that unnaturally prolongs it, turning a painful but finite chapter into a chronic condition? This leads to a troubling counter-argument, a flaw in the very design of our humanity. If love and attachment are so crucial for survival, ensuring the protection of vulnerable offspring and the strength of social bonds, why is the mechanism so brutally efficient at causing suffering? Evolution tends to prune away traits that are more harmful than helpful. Yet here we are, equipped with a capacity for connection that, when severed, can cripple us, leading to despair, depression, and in extreme cases, a loss of the will to live. Perhaps the answer lies in the sheer power of the incentive. The pain of loss is not a bug in the system. It is the system's ultimate feature. The threat of such devastating withdrawal is what makes us fight for our relationships, what compels us to compromise, to forgive, to stay. The potential for agony is the price of admission for the euphoria. It is the club that ensures we value the cradle. But this raises a darker possibility. Is the intensity of the bond and the corresponding intensity of the break a measure of its importance? Are we, in essence, wired to suffer profoundly for love because the alternative, a life without such deep attachment, was, in the grand calculus of survival, an even greater risk? Love, in the end, is the ultimate vulnerability. It is the conscious decision to hand another person the map to your own personal pain centers, to trust they will not press the buttons. It makes us fragile, irrational, and exquisitely susceptible to hurt. Yet, this same fragile thread of individual connection is what, multiplied across a community, creates the fabric of society itself. It is the foundation of families, of tribes, of civilizations built on cooperation and mutual care. The love between two people is a microcosm of the bonds that hold us all together, which forces us to ask a final, unsettling question. If the loss of one love can send a single human brain into a state resembling chemical withdrawal, what happens when an entire community, a whole society, experiences a collective heartbreak? What is the neurology of a broken culture, a people who have lost the story that bound them together? The pain of a single soul is a deep well, but the despair of a multitude is an ocean. And it is into that vast, uncharted sea that we must now turn our gaze. For in the mud-filled trenches of the First World War, a different kind of rupture was occurring, one that was not between two lovers, but between a man and his own sense of meaning. Thousands of soldiers were diagnosed with shell shock, their bodies trembling, their minds captive to nightmares, their spirits seemingly broken not by a visible wound, but by an invisible one. When the human brain is confronted with a horror so vast it cannot be processed, a fear that has no logical endpoint or escape, what story does it tell itself to survive? And what happens when even that story fails? In the churned mud and relentless gray of the World War I trenches, a strange malady took root. Men, physically unscathed by shell or shrapnel, would simply stop. They ceased to eat, to speak, to move. Their eyes, witnesses to unspeakable horror, would glaze over, fixed on some unseen point beyond the fray. They were casualties not of any visible enemy, but of an internal void. Medics of the time called it shell shock, a feeble term for a profound collapse. These soldiers did not die from their wounds. They perished from an emptiness. Their bodies remained, but the will to inhabit them had evaporated, as if the very engine of their being had shut down for lack of a destination. What happens when a human being is stripped of a future worth living for? At its core, this surrender is not merely psychological, it is biological, written in the intricate chemistry of the brain. Under normal circumstances, our minds are resilient, equipped with a pharmacy of its own to repair the wear and tear of stress. Two key compounds are serotonin, a neurotransmitter that acts as a stabilizer for mood, and brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF, a protein that functions like fertilizer for neurons, encouraging growth and connection. But prolonged, inescapable stress, the kind that grinds away day after hopeless day, drains these reserves. The system, designed to handle acute threats, is overwhelmed by a constant siege. Serotonin levels drop, leaving the mind adrift on a dark and turbulent sea. BDNF production falters, and the neural pathways that once carried thoughts of hope, purpose, and future begin to atrophy, like roads crumbling from disuse. The brain, that magnificent organ constantly seeking patterns and objectives, can no longer locate a why. And without a why, the how of continued functioning becomes a pointless exertion. The entire apparatus, deprived of its essential fuel, meaning, simply shuts down. Is the body, then, merely following the mind into a silence it has decreed? This is not a modern affliction. Long before we could measure neurotransmitters, our ancestors understood the corrosive power of meaninglessness. The archaeological record is not just a catalog of tools and bones. It is a testament to the human struggle against the void. From the careful burial of the dead at sites like Shanidar Cave, where pollen suggests flowers were laid upon graves 70,000 years ago, to the magnificent cave paintings of Lascaux, depicting a world alive with spirit and symbol, we see a species desperately imposing order on chaos. These rituals and myths were not primitive superstitions. They were sophisticated technologies of the soul. They transformed random tragedy, death, famine, loss, into a part of a larger, sacred narrative. A death was not an end, but a passage. A storm was not mere weather, but the wrath of a god. In doing so, they gave grief a container, a role to play. This was perhaps the first time profound sadness was not just endured, but organized, ritualized, and given a place at the communal fire. Could it be that by giving form to our sorrow, we prevent it from consuming us whole? The modern articulation of this ancient struggle comes from Viktor Frankl, a psychiatrist who survived the ultimate landscape of meaningless horror: the Nazi concentration camps. In his seminal work, Man's Search for Meaning, Frankl observed that those who survived were often not the physically strongest, but those who managed to cling to a sense of purpose, however fragile. He identified a phenomenon he termed the existential vacuum, a state of inner emptiness, a feeling that life lacks significance. This vacuum, he argued, is the fertile ground for what we now call existential depression, a deep, pervasive sadness that has no single clear cause like a personal loss or failure. It is a sorrow born from the abyss, the terrifying realization of one's own freedom and the apparent indifference of the universe. It is the grief for a meaning that has gone missing. If survival can hinge on the perception of purpose, does that make meaning a biological necessity, as vital as food or water? The counter-argument, of course, is a dangerous precipice. If a lack of meaning can lead one to surrender life itself, does it not follow that negative emotions, sadness, despair, angst, are merely obstacles to be eliminated? Our modern world, with its relentless pursuit of happiness and its arsenal of pharmaceuticals, often seems to suggest so. We pathologize melancholy, seeking to medicate it away. But what if this is a fundamental misunderstanding? The soldier in the trench, the prisoner in the camp, their suffering was not caused by the mere presence of sadness, but by the utter absence of a framework that could make that sadness meaningful. Their despair was absolute because it led nowhere. It was a circular path with no exit. To seek a life entirely free of negative emotion is to seek a life devoid of depth, of contrast, of the very stakes that make existence significant. Without the capacity for sorrow, could we ever truly comprehend joy? If we numb the pain of meaninglessness, do we not also risk numbing our capacity to seek meaning at all? When sadness ceases to be a reaction to a specific event and becomes instead the hollow echo of a life without purpose, we are forced to reconsider the very role of emotion in a life aimed somewhere. It is no longer a simple signal of pain, but a symptom of a deeper spiritual dislocation. This shifts the question from how we feel to what we value, and this, inevitably, draws us into the realm of morality. For if our emotional landscape is so intimately tied to our sense of purpose, then what is the relationship between a life well lived and the feelings that accompany it? Does a sense of right and wrong, of good and evil, originate not from cold logic, but from the very depths of our capacity to feel sorrow for a wrong committed or joy for a kindness done? Could it be that our conscience, that inner moral compass, is itself a biological invention with a social function, born from the same wellspring of emotion that can, in its absence, lead us to wither and die? The memory replays in your mind, a silent film on a loop. You saw it happen. The casual cruelty, the moment of vulnerability, the bystanders who looked away, yourself included. No one was physically hurt, not in any way the law would recognize. Yet, hours later, as you lie in the quiet dark, a cold, heavy stone settles in your chest. It has no physical form, this weight. No one imposed it upon you. It is a verdict delivered from a court within, a sentence of guilt for the crime of inaction. This feeling, so uniquely human in its self-inflicted nature, raises a quiet, unsettling question. Is this the very cradle of morality? Could our entire sense of right and wrong be a byproduct, an accidental echo of our capacity for sorrow? We often imagine morality as a set of rules, a codex handed down through philosophy or religion. But its roots may be far more primal, etched not on tablets of stone, but in the wet, intricate circuitry of the brain. Deep within your skull, behind the furrowed brow that you wear when wrestling with a difficult choice, lies the prefrontal cortex. More specifically, a region known as the ventromedial prefrontal cortex acts as a silent arbiter. It is the neurological stage where a simple conflict, I want this versus I should do that, is played out. When you walk past the person in need, this region doesn't light up with the fear of external punishment. Instead, it cross-references the action against a vast internal library of social scripts and empathetic responses. The resulting dissonance, the cognitive friction between what you did and what you feel you should have done, generates a specific, visceral signal. That signal is the raw, biological feedstock of guilt. It is a built-in regulatory mechanism, a governor on our selfish impulses that operates independently of any watchful eye. It is the body's way of saying that the cohesion of the tribe matters more than the immediate gratification of the individual. So, is this intricate neural architecture the source of our conscience, or merely the physical instrument through which a more abstract social need finds its voice? Long before we built courtrooms and wrote legal codes, we were building moral communities. Archaeological evidence from early hunter-gatherer societies reveals a world without police, without prisons, yet not without a profound sense of order. The greatest punishment was not physical harm, but social exile. To be cast out from the group, to be subjected to a ritual of shunning, was often a death sentence in a world where survival was a collective endeavor. These practices point to a powerful internalized enforcement system. The fear wasn't just of being caught. It was of the crushing weight of collective disapproval, the internalized shame that would follow. We can imagine a member of such a tribe having hoarded food or betrayed a trust, not merely fearing discovery but carrying the knowledge of their transgression like a physical burden. The community's rituals, the chants, the turned backs, the symbolic banishment, were simply the external triggers for a punishment the individual would ultimately administer to themselves. This guilt, this sorrow for a broken social contract, was the glue that held the fragile early human groups together. It was a more efficient tool than any club. But if this emotional glue was so effective at binding societies, what does it mean when it fails to dissolve, hardening instead into a permanent state of self-recrimination? This ancient mechanism, so vital for our ancestors' survival, has taken on a new and often pathological form in the modern world. In our hyper-connected, perpetually judgmental societies, the triggers for guilt and shame have multiplied exponentially. We are no longer just members of a single small tribe. We are citizens of a global village, bombarded with images of suffering we cannot alleviate and standards of success we cannot meet. The internal arbiter, the prefrontal cortex, can become overloaded, its signals distorted. In clinical settings, therapists consistently identify unresolved guilt and toxic shame as core drivers of anxiety and depression. This is particularly acute in individuals who possess a heightened moral sensitivity. For them, morality is not a guide, but a cage. Every minor failure, every perceived selfish thought, becomes evidence of their own inadequacy. The system designed to gently correct social behavior has become a weapon of relentless self-punishment. The very emotion that evolved to promote group harmony now isolates the individual in a prison of their own making. So, if guilt is the price of admission to a cooperative society, have we, in our complex modern world, begun to charge an unbearably high price? This presents us with a profound paradox. The negative emotion that guides us toward ethical behavior contains the seeds of its own potential for harm. It is a tool that can both build and destroy. What, then, is the line between a healthy moral compass and a pathological one? Is it a matter of degree, or is it about the source of the judgment? A healthy sense of guilt might arise from a specific action. I hurt someone, and lead to reparative behavior. But an unhealthy sense of shame attacks the core of the self. I am a bad person, and offers no path to redemption. This suggests that morality, born from sorrow, must be tempered by something else, perhaps by forgiveness, either from others or from oneself, or by a rational understanding that perfection is not the goal of being human. But where does that forgiveness come from in a system built on self-punishment? And who gets to define the standards that, when we fail to meet them, cause us such deep and abiding sorrow? Perhaps, then, morality is indeed a spectacular byproduct of our negative emotions. It is the intricate and beautiful scar tissue that forms over the wound of our innate selfishness, a reminder of the injury but also a sign of healing. Yet, this emotional foundation is dangerously malleable. It can be twisted by cultural narratives that equate wealth with virtue, or by personal trauma that teaches us we are fundamentally unworthy of love. When the delicate balance is upset, the system no longer serves the individual or the group. The internal judge becomes a tyrant, and the prison of guilt has no visible walls. This leads us to a darker, more unsettling consideration. If this powerful innate emotion can be so easily corrupted, then it becomes not just a foundation for ethics, but a potential instrument for control. What happens when external forces learn to manipulate this internal lever? When the very sorrow that makes us moral is harnessed not to guide us, but to command us. For if guilt is the invisible chain that binds the individual to the collective, then who holds the key? The rain falls with a soft, indifferent rhythm against the window pane, a sound that no longer registers to the woman sitting inside. Her world has contracted to a single, silent point of agony. A child's toy lies abandoned in the corner, a splash of color in the gray room, a monument to a life that was. She did not cause the accident. The truck's brakes failed. It was a statistical tragedy, a confluence of mechanical failure and bad timing. Yet, in the hollowed-out space where her heart used to beat, a different truth has taken root. She stops eating, not out of forgetfulness, but as a deliberate act. Her internal monologue is a relentless prosecutor, listing her failures. If only she had left a minute later, if only she had chosen a different route. Her hands sometimes find their way to her own arms, pressing nails into skin, a sharp, clean pain that, for a fleeting moment, eclipses the vast, formless anguish within. Why would a mind designed for self-preservation turn its tools of protection so decisively against its own vessel? Is this self-flagellation a primitive, hardwired instinct, or a profound malfunction in the human software? To understand this paradox, we must first look inward into the ancient architecture of the brain. Our emotional operating system, a legacy forged in the crucible of survival, is not solely concerned with external threats like predators or famine. It also governs the intricate social contracts that bind us together, the roles that ensure the group's, and therefore the individual's, continuation. The most primal of these is the role of the protector, particularly of one's young. When a mother loses a child through circumstances beyond her direct control, the biological alarm bells do not simply ring for the loss. They scream of a catastrophic failure in her core programming. The searing guilt, the self-directed fury, is not merely an emotion. It is a form of internal justice. The pain becomes a currency, a desperate offering made to the tribunal of her own psyche. It is a way of saying, I acknowledge the breach in the covenant. I am paying the debt. This neurological ritual is a dark echo of a physical one, where suffering is exchanged for a chance at inner equilibrium. Could it be that the mind inflicts pain upon the body to prevent a more total psychic collapse, a way to localize a diffuse catastrophe into a manageable physical wound? This internal tribunal did not emerge in a vacuum. Its echoes can be heard in the dust of ancient settlements and the whispered rituals of our ancestors. Long before modern psychology gave it a name, human societies had institutionalized the impulse for self-punishment. In many early cultures, a person who caused a death accidentally, through a hunting mishap, a building collapse, a simple mistake, was not simply absolved by the community's understanding. They were often required to undergo elaborate rites of purification. These were not punishments in the judicial sense, but necessary ceremonies for restoring balance. The individual might be ritually scarred, made to fast, or sent into a period of solitary exile. The physical pain or social isolation served a dual purpose. It was a tangible atonement offered to the community and the spirits, and crucially, it was a mechanism for the individual to process their own overwhelming guilt. By voluntarily enduring hardship, they could symbolically cleanse themselves of the taint of the tragedy. The pain was a bridge back to the group, a shared understanding that order, though shattered, could be slowly, painfully reassembled. Is the modern individual, alone in their apartment with their grief, merely performing a solitary, secular version of this ancient rite, but without the communal framework that once gave it meaning? In our contemporary world, stripped of such collective rituals, this ancient impulse contorts into new and troubling forms. We see it starkly in the phenomenon of self-harm among adolescents, a behavior often dismissed as a mere cry for help or a bid for attention. This interpretation misses the profound, desperate logic at its core. For a teenager drowning in a sea of unspoken expectations, academic pressure, and social rejection, the blade's sharp bite offers a perverse relief. It is not a desire for death, but a frantic attempt to regulate life. The overwhelming, abstract agony of feeling like a failure, of not meeting the invisible standards of their peers, their parents, their own relentless inner critic, is suddenly made concrete. The emotional pain is translated into a physical one, which is simpler, more immediate, and paradoxically easier to control. The act becomes a brutal, misguided coping mechanism, a way to assert agency when all other avenues of expressing or expiating guilt have been sealed shut. When a young person harms themselves, are they not, in the most tragic sense, attempting to draw a map of their internal chaos onto their own skin, trying to give a shape to the formless monster of their guilt? This leads us to an unsettling crossroads, a philosophical counterpoint that challenges the very nature of this impulse. Could it be that self-punishment, in its rawest form, is an adaptive trait? From an evolutionary perspective, a member who feels profound guilt after a group-endangering mistake might be more likely to engage in behaviors that reaffirm their value to the tribe, thus ensuring their continued protection. The pain motivates restitution, mending the social fabric. But what happens when the tribe is an abstract, demanding, and unforgiving modern society? What if the transgression is not a tangible failure to protect, but an inability to meet nebulous standards of success, beauty, or happiness? Then, this ancient instinct becomes a bug, not a feature. It is a vestigial program running in an environment for which it was not designed, a fire alarm that won't stop ringing long after the smoke has cleared. Is the relentless self-criticism of the modern individual, then, a sign of personal weakness, or is it evidence of a society that has perfected the art of generating guilt without providing any clear path to redemption? Perhaps the most profound question lies one layer deeper, in the shadowy intersection between the individual psyche and the structures of power. When a person torments themselves for failing to uphold social norms that are often invisible, unattainable, or even contradictory, who is the real beneficiary of this suffering? If a worker blames themselves for burnout, a student for a system's failure, or a citizen for a societal ill, they are effectively internalizing the conflict. The energy that might have been directed outward toward questioning or changing the system is instead turned inward, consumed in a cycle of self-recrimination. This internalization acts as a powerful social stabilizer. Could it be that the machinery of society, in its many forms, subtly encourages this impulse, this ready-made toolkit for self-flagellation? By keeping us occupied with the task of punishing ourselves for our perceived inadequacies, does it conveniently divert attention from the external forces that shape our lives? And if so, what does that say about the true nature of the cages we inhabit? This internal landscape of guilt and self-directed punishment, however, is not the final frontier of human sorrow. It is a private torment, a storm contained within a single skull. But history shows us that sadness can evolve, spilling out from the confines of the individual to become a collective fever, a sickness of the entire social body. This transition occurred when humanity made its most fateful shift, from a life of nomadic hunting and gathering to one of settled agriculture. With this revolution came a new kind of anxiety, one rooted not in the immediate threat of the predator, but in the slow, creeping dread of potential loss. When we began to own plots of land, to store harvests for the winter, and to plan for lineages that would inherit our accumulated wealth, the very center of our psychological gravity shifted. The fear of losing what we had built, the field, the house, the legacy, became a constant, low-grade hum in the background of civilization. This was the moment when melancholy was no longer just a personal wound. It was woven into the fabric of society itself, a ghost in the machinery of progress. What happens to the human spirit when the primary threat is no longer the claw in the night, but the silent, invisible blight that could wither the field by dawn? The leader stands before the crowd, a solitary figure etched against a sea of expectant faces. His voice does not boom with rage, it trembles with a carefully measured sorrow. He speaks of a nation's pain, of historical humiliation, of a collective wound that has never truly healed. The air grows thick, not with anger, but with a shared, resonant grief. And from that fertile ground of sadness, a seed is planted, a call to action, to reclaim lost honor, to right a perceived wrong. Soon the entire nation marches to war. This is the alchemy of power, grief, weaponized, sorrow, forged into a sword. This is not a new art. It is perhaps the oldest form of social engineering, a dark craft that preys on the very wiring of our minds. To understand the emotional manipulator is to embark on a journey through our own biology into the echoes of ancient tribal fires and onto the glaring stage of modern media, where the same primal levers are pulled with terrifying precision. The manipulation begins not in the political arena, but within the intricate labyrinth of the human brain. Neuroscience reveals a curious asymmetry in our emotional architecture. Negative emotions, fear, anger, sadness, command a priority slot in our conscious awareness. When we experience pain, a threat, or a profound loss, a klaxon sounds in the amygdala, the brain's ancient alarm system. This signal hijacks our attention, narrowing our focus to the source of the distress. It is a survival mechanism honed over millennia. The creature that dwells on the beauty of a flower, while a predator approaches, does not live to pass on its genes. This heightened state of alert, however, creates a cognitive vulnerability. Our critical faculties dim. The complex, nuanced world reduces to a simple binary, threat or safety, us or them. In this receptive, suggestible state, the mind is primed for a narrative, for an explanation that makes sense of the turmoil. It is at this precise moment that the manipulator offers a story, a target, a path. The profound grief of a personal loss can be seamlessly redirected into a collective hatred for an external enemy. The brain, seeking relief from its own anguish, clings to the offered solution. Is our capacity for deep feeling, then, not just a facet of our humanity, but also its most exploitable flaw? Long before neuroscientists mapped the amygdala, the tribal chieftains and shamans of our deep past understood this principle intuitively. Around the flickering light of a communal fire, power was not merely held by the strongest hunter, but by the most compelling storyteller. Archaeological evidence, from the remnants of ritual sites to the analysis of ancient oral traditions, suggests a recurring pattern. The consolidation of power often involved the curation of a shared painful memory. The shaman would recount the sorrow of the ancestors, a great famine, a brutal attack by a rival clan, the loss of a sacred hunting ground. This was not a simple history lesson. It was an emotional ritual. By collectively revisiting this trauma, the group's individual anxieties were fused into a single, powerful entity, a collective identity defined by its wounds. This shared sadness became the mortar that bound the tribe together, but it also required a brick to build against. The narrative inevitably created a common enemy, an other upon whom the pain could be blamed. The memory of a past defeat was not allowed to fade into history. It was kept fresh, a weapon to ensure loyalty and justify preemptive aggression. In the shadows of those ancient caves was the first political campaign born not from a promise of prosperity, but from a carefully tended garden of grief. The campfire has now been replaced by the glow of a smartphone screen, the shaman by the politician and the media personality, but the underlying mechanics remain hauntingly familiar. Modern emotional manipulation is simply the ancient craft scaled to an industrial level. The sorrow of the ancestors has been rebranded as historical grievance or national humiliation. The 24-hour news cycle and the algorithms of social media have become masterful engines for the mass production and distribution of collective sadness. A political campaign does not merely present a policy platform. It expertly taps into a reservoir of economic anxiety, cultural displacement, or social decline, framing it as a profound loss that only their leadership can remedy. The media, in its quest for engagement, understands that a story of tragedy, of injustice, of a community wronged, will capture attention far more effectively than one of complex, incremental progress. This constant drip feed of curated negativity does not just inform, it shapes reality. It forges what the political scientist Benedict Anderson called an imagined community, but one unified less by shared joy or aspiration than by a perceived shared victimhood. The tools are more sophisticated, the reach global, yet the goal is the same as it was for the tribal leader: to channel individual, diffuse anxieties into a cohesive, malleable collective will. When our news feeds become a relentless echo chamber of outrage and lament, are we participating in a democratic discourse, or are we being herded by digital shepherds? This relentless exposure to weaponized emotion forces upon us a deeply unsettling question. If our sadness, our fear, our righteous anger can be so easily triggered and directed by external forces, be it a leader, an algorithm, or a media narrative, can we truly claim to own our own feelings? Or are we merely the vessels through which programmed social scripts play out? The very emotions we consider the most intimate, the most authentic parts of ourselves, may be the most vulnerable to hijacking. The grief we feel for a distant conflict, the simmering resentment towards a faceless group, the pervasive anxiety about the future. How much of this is a genuine, organic response, and how much is the result of a sophisticated emotional engineering project? This line of inquiry threatens the core of our identity. If our inner world is not a sanctuary but a potential battlefield, then what remains of the autonomous self? And so, we arrive at the final thorny problem of defense. If sadness has been weaponized, what is the appropriate shield? Is the solution to be found in knowledge, in arming ourselves with critical thinking and media literacy, learning to deconstruct the narratives before they can take root? This is the hopeful path, the belief that the light of reason can dispel the shadows of manipulation. But what if the constant vigilance required to do this, the endless parsing of subtext, the questioning of every emotional appeal, leads not to liberation, but to a different kind of prison? What if the only way to avoid being manipulated is to become emotionally numb, to build a wall around our hearts and meet every tragic story, every call to collective feeling, with a cynical detachment? Is the price of mental sovereignty the very death of empathy? This is the manipulator's most insidious victory, forcing us to choose between being a pawn of emotion or a prisoner of isolation. Yet perhaps this dilemma itself is a symptom of a deeper malady, one that is woven into the fabric of our modern world. For the ancient brain, designed for the clear and present dangers of the savannah, now finds itself lost in a new kind of jungle. The predators have changed their form, and the very air we breathe seems to be saturated with a new, pervasive toxin. The fear no longer comes from the shadow of a saber-toothed tiger, but from the relentless ping of a notification. The sorrow is not just for a personal loss, but a diffuse anxiety pumped into our homes through 1,000 digital channels. Our emotions, it seems, are no longer solely our own. They have become a public utility, subject to contamination. In the sprawling artificial ecosystem of the city, the ancient brain struggles to process a constant, chaotic bombardment of stimuli. The deadline replaces the predator, the social media like becomes a distorted signal of tribal acceptance, and the collective grief of millions is compressed into a trending topic. This is the environment for which we are profoundly unequipped. How can we hope to discern authentic feeling from manufactured sentiment when our neural pathways are constantly being scrambled by an urban cacophony designed to hijack our attention? If our emotional landscape is now a polluted metropolis, what chance does a clear, quiet thought have to survive? He sat in the sterile room, the paper crinkling beneath him with every slight shift in weight. The loss was a geological fact, a canyon that had opened up in the landscape of his life, swallowing a future he had taken for granted. Yet, as he described the event to the doctor, the phone call, the silence that followed, the days that blurred into one another, his own voice sounded foreign to him, a calm, measured report on a distant catastrophe. There were no tears. There was no heaviness in his chest, no ache in his throat. There was only a vast, flat, internal silence. The doctor listened, nodded, and offered a term that sounded both clinical and strangely poetic: emotional blunting. The brain, it seemed, had not succumbed to sorrow. It had simply turned it off. But what does it mean when the very instrument designed to feel the world goes silent? Is this a failure or a profound ancient form of survival? The biology of this silence begins not as a malfunction, but as a desperate, elegant defense. Imagine the limbic system, the ancient seat of emotion nestled deep within the skull, as a sophisticated alarm network. For most of our lives, it processes a constant stream of data, a gentle hum of joy, spikes of frustration, the warm glow of connection. It is designed to handle storms, but every system has its limits. When stress arrives not as a passing squall, but as a sustained hurricane, or when trauma strikes with the force of a meteorite, the alarm bells ring until they break. The neurons, flooded with a relentless tide of cortisol and norepinephrine, begin to downregulate their receptors. It's not a conscious choice. It is a biological circuit breaker tripping to prevent a total meltdown. This is numbing, the brain's decision that feeling nothing is safer than feeling that. The pain is quarantined, the emotional signals are scrambled or muted, and the individual is granted a temporary, eerie reprieve. But this sanctuary is a hollow one. The same mechanism that shields you from the searing heat of grief also insulates you from the gentle warmth of a sunset, the spontaneous laughter of a child, the comforting touch of a hand. You become a disconnected observer in your own life, watching the colors of the world through a thick pane of soundproof glass. Is the self still there if it can no longer feel its own existence? This is not a new affliction of a fragile modern psyche. If we listen to the echoes from our past, we can hear the same silence in the dust of ancient battlefields. Consider a warrior of a forgotten empire, standing amid the carnage of a won battle. The adrenaline has faded, and he looks upon the faces of the fallen, friend and foe alike, with a gaze that is not triumphant, but empty. Historical accounts and epic poems often describe these veterans as hardened, stoic, or bereft of feeling. They performed the rituals of burial, they returned to their homes, but something behind their eyes had changed. They could no longer be stirred by the songs that once filled them with passion. The embrace of a loved one felt distant, like a memory of a sensation. What was once interpreted as strength or battle fatigue, we might now recognize as the ancestral ghost of post-traumatic stress disorder. Their emotional world, like the landscape they fought upon, had been scorched earth. The numbing was a survival tool that allowed them to function in the face of unimaginable horror, yet it came at the cost of the very humanity they were likely fighting to protect. Does the capacity for violence necessarily demand the erosion of the capacity for feeling? And if so, what does that say about the long shadow of trauma across generations? In our contemporary world, this paradox finds its most common expression in the quiet epidemic of depression. The popular image of depression is one of profound sadness, a bottomless pit of despair. But many who live within its grasp report something different, something perhaps more terrifying, a profound absence. It is not that they feel sad, it is that they feel nothing at all. The emotional palette, once vibrant with a spectrum of feelings, is reduced to shades of gray. Music loses its melody, food its taste, and love its pull. This is the ultimate irony of emotional blunting in depression. The emotional pain is so overwhelming that the system, in a final act of self-preservation, annihilates feeling itself. The wound is no longer painful because the nerve endings have been severed. Patients will often say they wish they could cry, because to cry would be to feel something, to be connected to the pain that proves they are still alive. The absence of sorrow is not a liberation. It is a different kind of prison, one without bars or windows, just an infinite, featureless interior. So, if the goal is to escape pain, does achieving a state of pure neutrality represent a success or the ultimate failure? This presents us with a difficult counterpoint. If emotional numbness is so destructive, if it robs us of joy and connection, then surely the goal must be to feel everything, to embrace even the negative emotions as essential to the human experience. We valorize vulnerability. We speak of leaning into our grief, of treating sadness not as an enemy but as a teacher. There is a deep wisdom here. Sadness slows us down, forces introspection, signals a need for comfort and community. Anger can mobilize us against injustice. Fear keeps us safe. To numb the negative is to build a dam that eventually holds back the entire river of feeling. Yet, this philosophy can become its own form of tyranny. Is it fair to ask the veteran, the abuse survivor, the deeply depressed individual to simply feel their feelings when those very feelings are a tidal wave threatening to obliterate them? The numbness was not a choice. It was a rescue. It is the body's own profound wisdom saying, "No more. Not now. I cannot bear it." So, where is the line between healthy emotional engagement and a trauma response that is, in its own way, necessary for survival? Is the capacity to feel negative emotion a privilege afforded only to those whose psyches have not been pushed to the absolute brink? Perhaps the problem, then, is not sadness itself, but our relationship with it. We live in a culture that often pathologizes normal human suffering, that seeks a pill or a protocol for every instance of discontent. We are taught to seek happiness as a default state and to view any deviation as a problem to be solved. In doing so, we may have forgotten how to simply sit with sorrow, to acknowledge its presence without being consumed by it, to let it wash through us like a season rather than a permanent climate. But this is a delicate art, a tightrope walk over an abyss. It requires a resilience that is not the same as numbness, a resilience built on support, on self-compassion, on the slow, patient work of integration. Can we learn to hold our pain gently, as one might hold a wounded bird, without either crushing it in a grip of fear or letting it fly away into the numbness of dissociation? Can negative emotions be trained, integrated into the tapestry of a life, so that they add depth and contrast rather than dominating the entire picture? This brings us to the precipice of a deeper, more unsettling question, one that lies at the heart of the modern human condition. We are told to be strong, but not invulnerable, to be sensitive, but not fragile. We are caught in an unprecedented emotional paradox, pulled in opposite directions by conflicting demands. How does one navigate a world that simultaneously glorifies stoic resilience and empathetic connection, a world that asks us to build fortresses around our hearts while keeping the gates wide open. The silence of numbed sadness is just one symptom of this deeper, more fundamental tear in our psychological fabric. If the goal is not to eliminate sadness, nor to succumb to the void of feeling nothing, then what is the shape of a wholeness that can encompass both the light and the dark? And is such a wholeness a destination we can ever truly reach, or merely a direction in which we can, despite everything, continue to travel? A child is born with a tremor in their spirit, a natural flinch from the dark, a quiet crumpling of the face when a toy is taken away. The raw materials of a self seem set, a predisposition toward caution, a sensitivity to rejection. Then, 10 years unfold. The same child, now standing before a room of strangers, speaks with a voice that is clear and steady. They feel the familiar clutch of anxiety, the old ghost of sadness, but these are no longer masters. They are passengers, acknowledged, sometimes even listened to, but not obeyed. This transformation poses a silent, monumental question. Are we the prisoners of our emotional inheritance, or are we, in fact, its architects? Is the landscape of our inner weather fixed by genetics and early circumstance, or can we learn to till the soil, to redirect the rivers, to build shelters against the storms? The answer, like most truths about the human condition, is not found in a single domain, but in the quiet conversation between them. It begins in the microscopic universe within our own skulls, a realm governed by both ancient codes and astonishing flexibility. We now know that certain genes, like variations of the 5-HTTLPR gene, act as volume knobs for our amygdala, the brain's alarm bell. For some, this bell is tuned to a piercing shriek, making the world feel perpetually like a place of potential threat. This is the biological bedrock, the initial slope of the emotional terrain we must navigate. It is real, it is tangible, and it can feel like an unchangeable fate written in the language of nucleotides. But the brain is not a static monument to its own blueprint. It is a living, breathing city, constantly rewiring its own streets. This is neuroplasticity, the silent, continuous remodeling of the brain based on experience. Every time we choose a different response, every time we sit with an uncomfortable feeling instead of fleeing from it, we are not just behaving differently. We are physically carving a new trail through the neural wilderness. The old path, the well-worn route of panic or despair remains, but it begins to grow over with disuse. The brain, in its profound wisdom, learns from repetition. It learns that the shadow does not always contain a predator, that the sting of rejection does not always mean exile. This is the first layer of hope, a scientific testament to our capacity for change. We are not merely reading from a script handed to us at birth. We are, with effort, rewriting it, line by line. To understand the depth of this training, we must step away from the MRI scanner and journey back to a time long before therapy offices and self-help books. Imagine a child in a prehistoric community. They were not pulled aside for a lesson on emotional intelligence or told to suppress their cries. Their education was woven into the fabric of survival itself. The initiation ritual, a trial of endurance and courage, was not about denying fear, but about moving through it. The young hunter, heart hammering against their ribs, learned to steady their breath alongside seasoned adults, their calmness a contagious, silent lesson. In the harshness of that world, grief was not a private shame to be hidden away. It was a communal experience, shared around a fire, its weight distributed across the shoulders of the tribe. The negative emotion, fear, grief, anger, was not an enemy to be eliminated. It was a crucial data point, a signal to be honed. Fear sharpened the senses for the hunt. Grief bonded the community in loss. Anger defended against a threat. The training was not about eradication, but about integration. The emotion was the rough ore. Experience and ritual were the tools that smelted it into a useful tool. Could it be that our modern struggle with negative emotions stems not from their existence, but from our alienation from this ancient practical curriculum? Have we lost the communal forge where these raw feelings were once tempered into strength? The modern world, for all its complexities, has developed its own forges. Cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, and mindfulness meditation are the contemporary equivalents of those ancient rites. CBT operates on a simple but revolutionary premise. Our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are inextricably linked. By identifying the distorted, catastrophic thoughts that fuel our negative emotions, I made a mistake, therefore I am a failure, we can challenge them, and in doing so, change the emotional response itself. It is a deliberate cognitive retraining of the emotional brain. Mindfulness, in contrast, is not about changing the content of the mind, but changing our relationship to it. It teaches us to sit on the riverbank and watch the turbulent waters of sadness or anxiety flow by, without feeling compelled to jump in and be swept away. Neuroscience confirms this. Seasoned meditators show decreased activity in the amygdala and strengthened connections to the prefrontal cortex, the brain's seat of rational judgment. This is the literal, physical manifestation of emotional regulation, the older, reactive parts of the brain being gently guided by the wiser, more observant ones. These practices are not mere positive thinking. They are evidence that we can, through systematic practice, re-sculpt the very circuits that generate our suffering. The slate is not entirely clean, but it is endlessly erasable. And yet, for all this promise, a stubborn counter-narrative persists. If emotional training is so possible, why do some souls, despite years of therapy, meditation, and immense personal effort, remain submerged in their sorrow? Why does the weight feel, for them, less like something to be lifted and more like a part of their very skeleton? This is the necessary counterpoint, the shadow that gives the light its shape. Perhaps for some, the emotional pattern is so deeply etched by trauma or a particularly potent genetic predisposition that it becomes a foundational layer of the self. The sadness is no longer a passing weather system. It has become the climate. It shapes how they perceive art, how they form relationships, how they understand the world. In this light, the emotion transcends being a mere feeling and morphs into something closer to identity. To attempt to train it away would feel like a kind of self-erasure, a violence against the core of who they are. Is the goal, then, always to move toward happiness? Or is there a dignity, even a strange wisdom, in learning to inhabit a melancholic landscape, to find its unique beauty and truth? This resistance to change forces us to ask, not just, can we train our emotions, but to what end? Is the objective a life free of pain, or a life of authentic depth, even if that depth is colored by shades of blue? So, we arrive not at an answer, but at a threshold. It seems we may have little control over the initial spark of a negative emotion, the jolt of fear, the pang of loss. These are the ancient autonomic gifts of our biology, the legacy of survival. But what happens next? The story we tell about that spark, the actions we take, the duration of its burn. This is the field of our potential training. It is not about controlling the weather, but about learning to build a sturdy shelter, to dance in the rain, or simply to sit and observe the storm without drowning in it. The negative emotion, then, shifts from being a flaw in the system to a potential source of information, of creativity, of connection. The artist's sorrow gives birth to profound beauty. The survivor's fear fuels relentless resilience. Perhaps the ultimate training is not elimination, but alchemy. We are not tasked with silencing the inner chorus of fear and sadness, but with learning its language, understanding its origins, and sometimes inviting it to sing a different, more harmonious song. And if we succeed in this training, if we learn to hold our sadness with a lighter grip, what then becomes of the parts of ourselves that were built by it? What new shadows might we cast when we try so hard to stand only in the light? This question leads us to a darker consequence, the inevitable toll of a culture that prizes perpetual sunshine, the silent punishment for emotions that have been forced into hiding, The image arrives first, seared into the cultural memory with a stark, unsettling clarity. A bandaged ear, a gas oven, a shotgun's echo. Vincent van Gogh, Sylvia Plath, Kurt Cobain. Their names are synonymous not just with the beauty they brought into the world, but with the profound and often terminal anguish that accompanied its creation. It presents a paradox that has haunted humanity for centuries. Why do those who gift us with sublime visions, who give voice to our deepest emotions, so often find themselves devoured by the very wellspring of their own genius? Is the capacity for creation intrinsically linked to a capacity for destruction? The artist's soul a fragile vessel where ecstasy and agony are two sides of the same thin coin? We begin this inquiry not in the therapist's office, but in the quiet electrical storm of the brain itself. Modern neuroscience has begun to map the terrain of this paradox, finding strange and compelling overlaps in the brain's geography. Studies suggest a tangible link between conditions like bipolar disorder or major depression and heightened activity within the brain's creative centers, such as the left prefrontal cortex. It is as if the same neural pathways that fuel the wild associative leaps of imagination, the ability to connect the seemingly unconnected, are also more susceptible to the turbulent weather of negative emotion. In this light, suffering is not merely a side effect. It becomes a kind of catalyst. The relentless churn of a depressive episode, the frantic energy of mania. These states can tear down the usual walls of perception, flooding the mind with a rawness of feeling that demands expression. The inner world becomes so vast, so intensely detailed in its shadows, that the only escape, the only way to make sense of the internal chaos, is to project it outward into a song, a painting, a poem. This is not the romantic notion of the brooding artist, but a biological reality. A brain that feels more deeply, for better and for worse, is a brain that has more raw material to sculpt. Does the very wiring that allows one to see the world in a unique, breathtaking hue also predispose one to see a darkness that others are spared from? To understand this relationship is to travel back far beyond the asylum or the recording studio to the very origins of human expression. Long before canvases and concert halls, our ancestors gathered in the flickering firelight of caves. And on those rocky canvases, they did not only paint the bounty of the hunt, the fat, sturdy bison. They also traced the outlines of their fears, their mysteries, their pain. They sculpted tiny, distorted figures, the so-called Venus figurines, with their exaggerated features, perhaps symbols of fertility and anxiety, or bone carvings of half-human, half-beast creatures dwelling in the spirit world. This primordial art was not mere decoration. It was a vital act of survival, the pain of loss, the terror of the unknown, the fragility of life. These were forces too powerful to be held inside. By giving them form, by externalizing them onto the walls of Lascaux or the pebbles of a burial site, our ancestors attempted to exert a measure of control. They were building a dialogue with their own suffering, transforming existential dread into a shared symbol. The artist, even 30,000 years ago, was the one who could take the collective wound and make it visible, and in making it visible, perhaps make it a little more bearable. Is the creative impulse, then, rooted in a fundamental human need to scream into the void and listen for an answering shape? In our modern era, this ancient dynamic has been filtered through the lens of psychology, commodified by culture and often dangerously simplified. The field of artist psychology acknowledges the potent use of sorrow as creative fuel, the alchemical process of turning leaden despair into golden verse. Yet it also sounds a cautious alarm against the pervasive, romanticized archetype of the tortured artist. This is a seductive narrative, one that has been woven into the fabric of how we view genius. It suggests that to be truly authentic, to create work that matters, one must be broken. This idealization can cast a long, sinister shadow. For the vulnerable individual, it can become a self-fulfilling prophecy, a reason to avoid treatment for fear of dulling their creative edge. The suffering ceases to be a symptom to be managed and becomes a badge of honor, a prerequisite for entry into the hallowed halls of artistic legitimacy. But what is the cost of this myth? Does the celebration of the artist's pain, however well-intentioned, inadvertently build a cage from which they cannot, or will not, seek escape? This leads us to the central, uncomfortable tension that lies at the heart of the matter. If profound sadness, if the jagged edges of a fractured psyche are the very ore from which great art is smelted, then what happens in the calm after the storm? If the tempest is quieted, does the well of inspiration run dry? Does healing equate to a kind of creative death, a silencing of the muse that only speaks in whispers of despair? It is a fear that has paralyzed many, a belief that medication or therapy will sand down the unique contours of their perception, leaving them normal and, by extension, artistically barren. But perhaps this is a false dichotomy, a limited view of the human spirit. Perhaps true artistry is not dependent on the storm itself.